Hello, good evening, everyone. Tonight, I'm hosting a discussion, part two, on Orientalism and Postcolonialism, the intellectual legacy of Edward Said. I'm once again very lucky to be joined by Hunger the Dye Merchant. How are you, sir?
I'm doing well. Thank you for having me once again.
And so just to recap for the audience watching, so last week in part one, we did a brief sort of biography of Said about who he was, where he came from, his sort of intellectual origins, and then we looked at the introduction and part one of his book, Orientalism. And so just to clarify for everyone, Orientalism is this idea which he describes as essentially this Western sort of obsession and interest with the Orient, which is rather toxic in his view because it's very inaccurate and misrepresentative of what the Orient and Middle East are. Though, as me and Hunger have sort of gone through, he's very disingenuous with how he conducts himself, and that's only going to become more pronounced as we get through parts 2 and 3 of this book. So, any comment you want to make at this point, Hunger, or?
Oh no, indeed. And we were just having a chat in the before the stream where his background really plays into his very unique perspective and why he takes the positions he does.
Oh yeah, certainly. This rather weird combination of being an Arab but also being a Protestant and also being a literary professor. It's all some unholy cocktail of disaster.
Oh no, yes, and the deeper you go, the worse it gets. His wife is a Quaker. His wife was a Lebanese Quaker. I'm just like, what in the world is a Lebanese Quaker doing in the Middle East? And there's this combination of European intellectualism and postmodernism with Arab nationalism. I mean, he is an Arab nationalist, but we'll get into that more and how those two contradictions really play into it.
I was actually argued not to split hairs, but I would say he's more of an Arab chauvinist than a nationalist, because I think a nationalist, there's such things having pride in your people or culture, then there's just being like a complete chauvinist where it's like, no, that my people are the only like good ones, fuck everyone else, essentially.
I would have more respect for him if he was more direct and forefront about that. But no, he hides it behind European man bad, and the entire message of Orientalism is European man bad, European knowledge bad.
No, and we're still living in the shadow of that, unfortunately, which is why we're doing this stream, because as I was saying before the stream and what I said on Twitter many weeks ago when I first proposed this stream, I very much think what Said was doing is, yes, he was deconstructing Orientalism, but what he was actually doing, whether intentionally or not, and I'm starting to believe more and more that it was intentional, was to replace Orientalism with some other structure, which is that of post-colonialism. Because, I mean, just look at Western institutions and educational establishments to this day. You've got this language of you've got to decolonize your bookshelf, you've got to decolonize the curriculum, and you've got to read all of these, African and Oriental voices and expressions. Don't read Shakespeare, read this queer black feminist from like Botswana or something.
And the problem with that, with the queer black feminist, and the problem with Edward Said is the ethnic narcissism is kind of bubbling under the surface of humanist liberalism. These people are just liberals. They're Western educated. Their mind is colonized by Western ideas and Western perspectives, but deep down in their soul or in their biospirit, they know they're not Western. They know they're not European. And I have no issue with that. I'm Middle Easterner. I call myself a Med because I identify more with the Mediterranean than with the Saudis or the Qataris. The Mediterranean people are much more my people, and I have no issue saying that. But when you have that deep identity, and there's no contradiction in that identity, then you can be more honest about these things. Whereas the black feminist, the black gay feminist, and people like Edward Said are not honest in that regard.
No, because if they were, then they'd have to confront that contradiction within themselves, and perhaps it would shatter their mind, possibly. Well,
Indeed.
Right. Okay. Yeah. So part 2, Said titles Orientalist Structures and Restructures, and I've got 2 images up on here of 2 very famous French Orientalists of the 19th century. I've got Antoine Isaac Sylvestre de Sacy and Ernest Renan. So these are 2 of the main figures Said critiques in this part of the book, and he christens de Sacy the sort of the originator of Orientalism, and Renan as like the preserver or the continuer. So once de Sacy died, Renan was the one who kind of kept the torch burning, so to speak. So one I want to begin with is he starts this section by returning to Foucault and Vico with their respective ideas of the episteme and historicism, to this idea that the Western mind cannot comprehend the East. And there's a reading I want to make. I'm just going to get the page. So, okay, this is page 118. So yeah, but there was a tendency among some thinkers to exceed comparative study and its judicious surveys of mankind from China to Peru by sympathetic identification. This is a third 18th century element preparing the way for modern Orientalism. What today we call historicism is an 18th century idea. Vico, Herder, and Hamann, among others, believe that all cultures were organically and internally coherent, bound together by a spirit, genius, klima, or national idea, which an outsider could penetrate only by an act of historical sympathy. Thus, Herder's Ideen zur Philosophie der Geschichte der Menschheit, 1784 to 1791, was a panoramic display of various cultures, each permeated by inimicable creative spirit, each accessible only to an observer who sacrifices prejudices to Einfühlung, imbued with a populist and pluralist sense of history, advocated by Herder and others. An 18th century mind could breach the doctrinal walls erected between the West and Islam and see hidden elements of kinship between himself and the Orient. Napoleon is famous instance of this, usually selective, identification by sympathy. Mozart is another, the magic flute in which Masonic codes intermingle with visions of a benign Orient, and the abduction from the seraglio locates a particularly magnanimous form of humanity in the Orient, and this, much more than the modish habits of Turkish music, drew Mozart sympathetically eastwards. It is very difficult nonetheless to separate each such institutions of the Orient and Mozart from the entire range of pre-Romantic and Romantic representations of the Orient as exotic locale. Popular Orientalism during the late 18th century and the early 19th century attained a vogue of considerable intensity, but even this vogue, easily identifiable in William Beckford, Byron, Thomas More, and Goethe, cannot be simply detached from the interest taken in Goethe's in Gothic tales, pseudo-medieval ideals, visions of barbaric splendour and cruelty. Thus, in some cases, the Oriental representation can be associated with Piranesi's prisons, in others with Tiepolo's luxurious ambiences, in still others with the exotic sublimity of late 18th century paintings. Later in the 19th century, in the works of Delacroix and literally dozens of other French and British painters, the Oriental genre tableau carried representation into visual expression and a life of its own. Sensuality, promise, terror, sublimity, idyllic pleasure, intense energy, the Orient as a figure in the pre-Romantic, pre-technical Orientalist imagination of late 18th century Europe was really a chameleon-like quality called, adjectively, Oriental. But this free-floating Orient would be severely curtailed with the advent of academic Orientalism. So here, Said is very much trying to argue that Orientalism is some product of the European Romantic movement. So these are figures such as, in Germany, especially, you've got people like the Brothers Grimm who would publish their folk tales. You've also got people such as Wagner and his operas, which were inspired by Norse and Germanic mythology, and many such others. And furthermore, in the art world, you mentioned Delacroix there. Well, for those who watch this channel, you may recall a couple of months ago, I had Mr. D on for a 2-part stream on Orientalist art. And we heavily looked at the art of Delacroix and also the work of Jean-Léon Gérôme, who was a student of Delacroix's. And yes, I think we could say that the West, especially the French, had a obsession with this part of the world. And very much when I looked at those, Mr. D looked at those paintings, I do agree there was very much a romantic quality, especially in the Delacroix paintings. Is there anything you want to come in with here, Hunger? Or
No, I think that's right, and I think that two things I would comment on is, one, he says the free floating Orient, or that's what the way I interpreted that was, before European scholarship and exploration and knowledge, that the Orient existed as its own thing, and no one outside of the Orient itself really knew anything about it. But because these Europeans came in, and because they studied Arabic, they studied Islam, they studied the language, that they took that free floating Orient and categorized it and made it into something digestible. Like this is a region of the world that we can understand now, because we have this knowledge that we've accumulated by studying their language, their customs, their history. And I think that's a very important statement. It's like, oh, before that, it's this idyllic, it's its own thing. It's living in its own world, and it kind of was living in its own world before the Europeans came in. But that's what the Europeans did was, when they had this scholarship and academic interaction with the Orient, it became this real thing that we could tell other Europeans about. And the other thing I also wanted to say, excuse me, was he mentions this difference between the British and the French view of the Orient, and I think this is very important. He says this later on in the book, but it's very important. It sets the tone for who he targets and the intellectual figures he targets, like de Sacy and Renan, compared to the British scholars and the British intellectuals. He says, give me 1 second. The British and French point of view. What was the Orient for the individual traveler in the 19th century? Consider first the differences between an English speaker and a French speaker. For the former, the Orient was India, of course, an actual British possession. To pass through the Near Orient was therefore to pass en route to a major colony. Already then, the room available for imaginative play was limited by the realities of administration, territorial legality, and executive power. Scott, Kinglake, Disraeli, Warburton, Burton, and even George Eliot are writers, like Lane himself and Jones before him, for whom the Orient was defined by a material possession, by a material imagination, as it were. England defeated Napoleon, evicted France. What the English mind surveyed was an imperial domain which, by the 1880s, had become an unbroken patch of British-held territory from the Mediterranean to India. To write about Egypt, Syria, or Turkey, as much as travel in them, was a matter of touring the realm of political will, political management, political definition. The territorial imperative was extremely compelling, even for so unrestrained a writer as Disraeli, whose Tancred was not merely an Oriental lark, but an exercise in the astute political management of actual forces on actual territories. So all the British writers, and much so they're like sociologists and philologists, were concerned about material reality and the material conditions of the Middle East itself, as opposed to the French. And Said says about the French, in contrast, the French pilgrim was imbued with a sense of acute loss in the Orient. He came there to a place in which France, unlike Britain, had no sovereign presence. The Mediterranean echoed with the sounds of French defeat, from the Crusades to Napoleon. What was to become known as la mission civilisatrice, civilizationism, or civilizing, began in the 19th century as a political second best to Britain's presence. Consequently, French pilgrims from Volney on planned and projected for, imagined, ruminated about places that they were principally in their minds. They constructed schemes for typically French, perhaps even European concert in the Orient, which, of course, they suppose would be orchestrated by them. Theirs was the Orient of memories, suggestive ruins, forgotten secrets, hidden correspondence, and an almost virtuosic style of being, an Orient whose highest literary forms will be found in Nerval, Flaubert, both of whose work was solidly fixed in an imaginative, unrealizable, except aesthetically, dimension. So the French travelers and scholars were far more concerned about had a far more romantic notion and had a far more adventurous notion of the Orient compared to the British, who were empiricists by philosophically empiricist. They cared about the numbers, the conditions, the material reality on the ground, whereas the French, being swarthy European men, cared about the romance, the adventure, the thrill, and the excitement of these mysteries and secrets of the Middle East. And I think that that's very clear. He very clearly attacks the French far more than the English on that front for being, in some ways, more idealist than the British.
Hmm. That's interesting you've read that bit, and especially this idea of the French sort of this kind of sense of like loss of the of the the Crusades when the Christian, well, not Christians, but essentially it's just interesting, this idea that you don't sort of have this romantic notion of the Crusades not because it was a Christian defeat in the Holy Land, but rather because the Crusades were an extension of French Catholic sort of feudalism in the Middle East, that it's
Yeah,
somehow a loss for France rather than a loss for Christianity, which I think is an
yeah
interesting angle.
the Frankish kingdoms, the kingdom of Acre, the kingdom of Jerusalem. Yeah, these were French. These were the first French colonies in the Middle East. One could argue, but that's coming from a 20th century point of view. That these nationalisms were there at that time, and it wasn't. It was more nationalist than Christian. But no, I mean the reality of the Crusades. It was Christian. It was European Christendom coming to the Middle East, not just French Catholics coming to the Middle East.
Indeed, but we can't deny the very strong French cultural influence, because it was French style feudalism that was managed in those Crusader states, and of course, what was the name for them? It was the Outre-mer, or French for over the sea, and I just can't help but think back to the two streams I did with Prude on the legacy of Sykes-Picot, when you have is it General Henri Gourart, the general who comes in and establishes French control over Syria and kicks out Faisal. And you have that incident where he literally struts into Saladin's tomb and kicks it, exclaiming, "The cross has triumphed over the crescent." And it's just this absurd, like French Crusader LARP.
Indeed, yeah. The British were far more practical and realistic about their entire mission in the Middle East was geopolitical. It was always about India. Like to a British man or a British high officer, the Orient was India, whereas to the French it was much more about North Africa and the Levant. The Levant and North Africa was the Orient, whereas to a British officer it was the Levant was a way to get to India.
Because India was, as it was called, the jewel in the crown, the most important imperial possession of the British Empire. So control of the Orient meant strategic control on the way to link to India, which is why the British were very keen to take over Egypt and the Suez Canal in the latter parts of the 19th century. So I now want to move on into some of his commentary actually on de Sacy and Renan. And this whole section, he has them as titled Sylvester de Sacy and Ernest Renan, Rational Anthropology and Philological Laboratory. And I just want to talk about this expression, philological laboratory, because I think this is the influence of Foucault coming in again, because, well, what does philological laboratory mean? So philology is the study of languages, and obviously laboratories where, you conduct experiments. So you've got this image of sort of languages being dissected and studied in this sort of cold, rational environment. And this really smacks of Foucault's concept of the clinical gaze, or that, in postmodernity, everything is kind of just analysed in this cold, rational fashion with no emotion and whatsoever. Is there anything you want to add to that, or?
No, he had there's an interesting critique, especially of de Sacy. Renaud was a philologist, but throughout chapter 2, Edward Said rails against philology, and he takes a couple quotes from Nietzsche about this. He takes a couple quotes from Nietzsche. The main argument of Said is that what the philologists did is that they categorized this foreign people into this understandable category. And before that, like I said, the free-floating Orient. There was this idyllic Orient. And then the philologists came in and they started studying Arabic, and they impugned from the study of Arabic and the dead Middle Eastern languages, languages like Aramaic, like Hebrew, all the ancient languages of the Middle East. They categorized it into, this is the Semitic family of language, because it has no link to the Indo-European family of languages, and that categorization separated the Arabs from the Europeans, and that, again, this is an otherization of the Arabs because they have this different base of language and this different family of languages.
And no, thank you for that. And it's interesting, again, because I mentioned this in the last stream, but I think I mentioned it also before we started streaming, that, you know, part of Said's whole worldview and how he conducts his investigation is the fact that he's a literary critic. And in the last stream, I mentioned that in English academia, there's a rivalry between the literary or literature department and the language department. And you know, literature scholars absolutely hate philology and language, and this is where this really comes into why he hates de Sacy and Renan so much. So I just want to do a little bit of reading from this chapter. So, the two great themes of Sylvester de Sacy's life are heroic effort and a dedicated sense of pedagogic and rational utility. Born in 1757 into a Jansenist family whose occupation was traditionally that of notaire, Antoine Isaac Sylvester was privately tutored at a Benedictine abbey, first in Arabic, Syriac, and Chaldean, and then in Hebrew. Arabic in particular was the language that opened the Orient to him, since it was in Arabic, according to Joseph Renaud, that Oriental material, both sacred and profane, was then to be found in its oldest and most instructive form. Although a legitimist in 1769, he was appointed the first teacher of Arabic at the newly created school of Langues Orientales Vivantes, of which he became director in 1824. In 1806, he was named professor at the Collège de France, although from 1805 on, he was the resident Orientalist at the French Foreign Ministry. There his work, unpaid until 1811, at first was to translate the bulletins of the Grande Armée and Napoleon's Manifesto of 1806, in which it was hoped that Muslim fanaticism could be excited against Russian orthodoxy. That's quite an interesting idea of the Napoleon there, to basically use, try to encourage Muslim jihad against a foreign power. That's fascinating because later in World War I, Germany would try the same thing vis-a-vis the Ottoman Empire. They would try and use the Ottomans' position as the Caliph of Islam to stir up some international jihad against the Entente powers, the British and the French. So it's just interesting to see how history sort of echoes itself there. Is there anything you wanted to come in with there?
Oh no, absolutely. The Sultan of the Ottoman Empire had literally declared a fatwa that World War I is our jihad against the European powers while being allied to Germany, you know, at the same time. And it's the British and the French that are the problem. We must jihad against them. And the Sultan was expecting the Muslims of India to rise up and overthrow their British masters, but that never happened, and that never happened. They had no interest rising up against the British. But it's not surprising because it's not surprising of that statement, because the British and the French had allied with the Ottomans against the Russians. I mean, we literally had the Crimean War in 1855, where the British and the French were triangulating with the Turks to recapture Crimea for the Ottoman Empire. So yeah, this was it always goes back to European power politics at the end of the day, and why the Ottoman Empire lasted so long.
No, indeed. And so just to correct you, the Crimean War wasn't to claim Crimea for the Ottoman Empire. It was simply to shore up the Ottoman Empire against Russian expansion, because the main cause of the war was basically Nicholas I of Russia and Napoleon III of France were basically having a dick measuring contest over who could be the protector of the Eastern Christendom, Christians. So, Nicholas was trying to be the champion of the Orthodox, while Napoleon III was protecting the Catholics, and that was the main cause of the war. And Britain only really got involved because it saw an opportunity to try and cut Russia down to size. So, but
the British were always the British were always concerned about a new continental power, and they, whether it was Napoleon or whether it was Alexander the First, they never wanted a single European power to control the continent. And I will, as an Orthodox Christian, I will never forgive the British for stopping the Russians at the gates of Constantinople twice in 50 years from recapturing Constantinople.
But again, then there was always that weird attempt to be allied with Russia to try and take Constantinople, and we completely failed. Thanks, Churchill.
Indeed, many such cases.
Right, I shall continue reading. But for many years thereafter, Sarsi created interpreters for the French Oriental Dragomanate, as well as future scholars. When the French occupied Algiers in 1830, it was Sarsi who translated the proclamation to the Algerians. He was regularly consulted on all diplomatic matters relating to the Orient by the foreign minister, and on occasion by the Minister of War. At the age of 75, he replaced Dacier as secretary of the Académie des Inscriptions, and also became curator of Oriental manuscripts at the Bibliothèque Royale. Throughout his long and distinguished career, his name was rightly associated with the restructuring and reforming of education, particularly in Oriental studies. In post-revolutionary France, with Cuvier, Sarsi in 1832 was made a new peer of France. It was not only because he was the first president of the Société Asiatique, founded in 1822, that Sarsi's name is associated with the beginning of modern Orientalism. It is because his work virtually put before the profession an entire systematic body of texts, a pedagogic practice, a scholarly tradition, and an important link between Oriental scholarship and public policy. In Sarsi's work, for the first time in Europe since the Council of Vienne, there was a self-conscious methodological principle at work as a coeval with a scholarly discipline. No less important, Sarsi always felt himself to be a man standing at the beginning of an important revisionist project. He was a self-aware inaugurator, and more to the point of our general thesis, he acted in his writing like a secularized ecclesiastic for whom his Orient and his studies were doctrine and parishioners respectively. The Duc de Broglie, an admiring contemporary, said of Sarsi's work that it reconciled the manner of a scientist with that of a biblical teacher, and that Sarsi was the one man able to reconcile the goals of Leibniz with the efforts of Bossuet. Consequently, everything he wrote was addressed specifically to students. In the case of his first work, his Princeps de Grammaire Générale, 1799, the student was his own son, and presented not as a novelty, but as a revised extract of the best that had already been done, said, or written. These two characteristics, the didactic presentation to students and the avowed intention of repeating by revision and extract, one crucial. Sarsi's writing always conveys the tone of a voice speaking. His prose is dotted with first-person pronouns, with personal qualifications, with rhetorical presence. Even at his most recondite, as is a scholarly note on 3rd century Sassanid numismatics, one senses not so much a pen writing as a voice pronouncing. The keynotes of his work is contained in the opening lines of the dedication to his son of the Principe de Grammaire Générale. C'est à toi, mon cher, fil que c'est peut-être au revoir, et de t'entrepris, which is to say, I am writing or speaking to you because you need to know these things. And since they don't exist in any serviceable form, I have done the work myself for you. Direct address, utility, effort, immediate and beneficent rationality. For Sarsi believed that everything could be made clear and reasonable, no matter how difficult a task and how obscure the subject. Here are Bossuet's sternness and Leibniz's abstract humanism, as well as the tone of Rousseau, altogether in the same style. So, with that part I've just read, Said really doesn't like this idea of academic authority, or the idea that you have this very intelligent and hardworking academic scholar who's trying to do serious work, and provide authority to what he's doing. And I get why he has a problem because he doesn't agree with him. But I think in turn, to attack Sarsi in this way, you were kind of, you're deconstructing the entire Western, academic tradition, which, okay, isn't perfect, but I think it's a very solid educational practice. I mean, what do you think?
No, I think I would agree with that. And what he does, what I see Said doing in this passage and in many other passages throughout the book, on many other authors, is that he's mind reading. He's mind reading into these authors' intentions or emotions that maybe if I read the original work, maybe I would get the same impression. But from what Said quotes, I don't get that impression at all from any of these other writers or thinkers. In some ways, it's more explicit. Like, when you have a French general saying the cross has overcome the crescent, you can impugn. It's very understandable what that motive is. But when it comes to Dissassi, he's impugning these motives of, like, it goes back to the first part of our stream, where there were these many European scholars who were very intelligent, who loved their work, who were fascinated by the Orient and the Middle East, studying the language, studying the history, studying the culture. But the governments of those nations, like France and the UK, used that canon of knowledge to enact certain policies, or it enabled them to enact certain policies, like Napoleon's expedition to Egypt, like the British occupation of Egypt in the later century. That's the impression I get from him, and that's what I always see Said impugning these motives that I don't see there in the beginning. Because Dissassi, he was the founder of modern Orientalism, and when Said says it's like he's not writing with a pen, but he's speaking with a voice, like what am I supposed to take away from that, other than this man thinks he is the sole authority, and that the quality of his work itself is irrelevant. It's the fact that he is an authority figure, shouting from the rooftops that I know the Orient better than anybody else. Like, that was probably true. That was probably true in the early 1800s. But to give Said his credit, I see why there would be an issue with authority on history and with authority on the cultures of other people. A great example of this, I know this example because I'm an Orthodox Christian. Edward Gibbon's Decline and Fall of the Western Empire. Decline and Fall of the Roman Empire. In the first, I believe it's like 7 volumes. In the first 3 or 4 volumes, he expounds huge amounts of knowledge and energy into the early Roman Republic and Empire, and you can't deny that he's a huge admirer of the ancient Roman Republic and Empire, and that he impugns in his words this vitality and greatness and scale that in the later issues of the book, because the Decline and Fall of the Roman Empire goes through the Byzantine Empire as well. In the final 3 volumes of the book, he absolutely shits on everything the Byzantine Empire did, and gives them no credit, diminishes all their accomplishments, says they're an inferior product. They're an Eastern breakaway who are actually Greek. They're not really Roman. And Gibbon's book was so influential that it destroyed 100 years of Byzantine scholarship for the entire century. No one was interested in the Byzantine Empire after Gibbon until the very late 1800s, during the Russian Empire, when Russian writers wanted to revive the idea of Byzantium. So I understand Said's problem with authority, because scholars do have that power to shape the minds of the people who read them.
Oh, that's interesting. Thank you for that. I've sadly never read Decline and Fall of the Roman Empire, but I've been meaning to one day. And to add to that as well, from my understanding, he also talks about Charlemagne, and even because I've mentioned before, I've been reading Glub again recently. Apparently, Gibbon also covered the Arab conquest as well, which is interesting how he fits that all in together when talking about the Roman Empire. But that's besides the point. One thing I want to bring in about this idea of authority is he mentions Bossuet there, just to give some elaboration for the people who don't know who Bossuet is. Bossuet was a clerical minister in the government of Louis XIV of France, and Apostolic Majesties talked about Bossuet in one of his streams on French absolutism, and Bossuet was kind of the ideological champion of what French absolutism was, and he basically, I forget the name of the book, but he wrote this defense of French absolutism on these on religious grounds, that basically, so he gave like a clerical or ecclesiastical justification for why France should have an absolute monarchy, and these ideas of authority, essentially, and that of the king, the divine right of the king. And so this is where it's coming in with de Sacy, why he says de Sacy is a fusion of Leibniz, who was a scientist, I think a chemist, and Bossuet, because you've literally got the scientist and like the cleric combined into a single person.
No, I definitely understand that. I mean, like, I can see Said's point. We're living in the world of 2023, where if anybody says if anybody says the words "trust the science," you would immediately be skeptical of everything that person says, and he's kind of implying that same motive to de Sacy. De Sacy is saying, like, trust the science, trust my scholarship, my word is law. But I don't think that's what de Sacy is saying. I think he was very honest about what he was doing, and he did, to the best of his abilities, try to understand the Middle East, and he came at it from a very sympathetic perspective, and I don't think Said gives him enough credit for that. I do want to read this one passage, speaking on the authority of de Sacy and why de Sacy was so important to the entire field of Orientalism. This is Said speaking on de Sacy. Sacy's anthologies not only supplement the Orient, they supply it as Oriental presence to the West. Sacy's work canonizes the Orient. It begets a canon of textual objects passed on from one generation of students to the next. And the living legacy of Sacy's disciples is astounding. Every major Arabist in Europe during the 19th century traced his intellectual authority back to him. Universities and academies in France, Spain, Norway, Sweden, Denmark, and especially Germany were dotted with the students who formed themselves at his feet and through the anthological tableau provided by his work. As with all intellectual patrimonies, however, enrichments, restrictions were passed on simultaneously. Sacy's genealogical originality was to have treated the Orient as something to be restored, not only because of, but also despite the modern Orient's disorderly and elusive presence. Sacy placed the Arabs in the Orient, which was itself in the general tableau of modern learning. Orientalism belonged therefore to European scholarship, but its material had to be recreated by the Orientalist before it could enter the arcades alongside Latinism and Hellenism. This is what he's saying. He's saying the work of de Sacy and all of his students after him throughout Europe recreated this idea of the Orient that hadn't been in the European mind before the 1800s. And I don't think that's true. I think the Europeans, I think the European understanding of the Arabs pre-Orientalism is it was more so of a religious conflict, and it was more so of a struggle against the Ottoman Empire. And it's not like they didn't understand the Ottomans. There were Europeans in the Ottoman Empire. They had missionaries, they had ambassadors. It's not like they didn't understand what was going on, but it was the introduction of scholarship and authority on these subjects that formed this image of the Orient.
Mm-hmm. I see. No, thank you very much for bringing that up and doing that reading. And just to go back about the whole, I know what you mean about, trust the science. A lot of us would be very skeptical of that today. But the thing is, we don't practice proper science anymore. We practice Lysenkoism, effectively. Whereas back this RC was, I think, that you could still say that was true science to some extent.
to meet Said halfway. If you take the perspective that yes, Europeans have certain biases. Yes, they call the Orient tyrannical, they call the Orient despotic, they call the Orient backwards. If you just take the known biases of the group of people studying the object, then you can understand the object better. Given if you understand your own biases, then you know where your weak points are, and then you can have a more accurate understanding of the thing. And the one thing I really want to get across is it's not just the Sassi, it's throughout Said's Orientalism. It's that he always criticizes the Europeans for generalizing, quote unquote, the Arabs. Who are the Arabs? The Arabs are the 100 million people all the way from Morocco to the borders of Persia, and that they have this one religion, this one language, and that like there's no such, and Said says there's no such thing as an Arab, like an Arab as a category. And this is what the European does. It's all these people in the Middle East are just Arabs, and this is a general category, and they all have these static ways of being and patterns of behavior. The problem with that point of view is not that he's wrong. The problem with what the Europeans did in generalizing all the Arabs is that they weren't racist enough. They weren't categorizing the peoples of the Middle East enough. Like I have this book by Sir John Bagot Glubb, and it's called A Short History of the Arab Peoples, quote unquote, the peoples of Arabia. And it goes in the introduction of the book. He categorizes them far more accurately than the Europeans of the 18th century just saying the Arab. The Arab peoples are, let me just bring this up very quickly. There are the Central Arabians. Yep, go
on. Yes, because where I've been reading him at the moment, he uses that term a lot in the Great Arab Conquests. Is yes, the Central Arabians that charged forth from their peninsula and conquered the area, and he's talking about how over time there was this like sort of racial decline as they started like intermarrying with like Syrians and Egyptians and Persians and whatnot. So,
indeed, but again, the Europeans were not. Their categories were wrong because they were not being racist enough. Like in Glubb's book, you have the Central Arabs. He divides the Central Arabs. You have the Syrians, you have the Iraqis, you have the Egyptians, you have the Southern Arabians, and then you have the North Africans. These are the much more accurate categories. And he says in this one passage on the Syrians, including the Lebanese and the Arabs of Palestine, Syria forms a complete contrast to Saudi Arabia. Whereas no foreign invaders were tempted by Arabia, the history of Syria is little more than a list of foreign invasions. The climate of Syria was tempting to races from colder northern countries. Moreover, the long narrow strip of country from Aleppo to Gaza, confined by the Mediterranean on one side and the desert on the other, constituted an isthmus joining Asia and Eastern Europe to Africa. From the dawn of history, an endless succession of invading armies and migrating nations traveled up and down the Syrian causeway. So the Syrians are a different people from the Bedouins of the Arabian desert. And you don't get this from early European scholarship because they didn't have that body of knowledge. Before them, they didn't have that body of knowledge to understand it better. It was the people that came after them that had a more accurate understanding of them, and the people who lived there, like John Bagot Glubb, who served in the Jordanian army. Because he lived there, he found through personal experience the differences between the Saudis, the Jordanians, the Egyptians, and the Iraqis. And you don't get that from early European work. It's not that they were wrong, it's that they weren't accurate enough.
Yes, because I think a lot of them were studying it from afar, as you said, Glubb actually served in that region and actually met a lot of the people, and I think that's why he was more accurate. And obviously there's a stream I did earlier in the year on this channel where I was reading Glubb's The Middle Eastern Crisis, and again, in that pamphlet, he absolutely hammers home this difference between all the different peoples, that, you know, a Jordanian and a Palestinian aren't the same, which is why this idea of, oh yes, you can just kick the Palestinians into Jordan, it will be fine, they're the same people, right?
No, they are not the same people. And if you talk to a real Jordanian, if you talk to a pre-1948 Jordanian, they will tell you they're not the same as a Palestinian. Absolutely not. If you just talk to people on the ground, they will tell. It's on one hand, it's the narcissism of small differences, but on the other hand, like, there are real identifying markers that separate these people and say, you're not part of my tribe. You're part of that tribe, and I know that tribe because we live next to each other.
Mm. No, well, thank you for bringing that all up. And I now want to move on to Renan. So I've got another bit of reading I want to do on Renan. So Renan was a figure in his own right, neither of total originality nor of absolute derivatativeness. Therefore, as a cultural force or as an important Orientalist, he cannot be reduced simply to his personality, nor to a set of schematic ideas in which he believed. Rather, Renan is best grasped as a dynamic force whose opportunities were already created for him by pioneers like Sarsi, yet who brought their achievements into the culture as a kind of currency, which he circulated and recirculated with to force an image a little further, his own unmistakable recurrency. Renan is a figure who must be grasped, in short, as a type of cultural and intellectual praxis, as a style for making Orientalist statements within what Michel Foucault would call the archive of his time. What matters is not only the things that Renan said, but also how he said them, what, given his background and training, he chose to use as his subject matter, what to combine with what, and so forth. Renan's relations with his Oriental subject matter, with his time and audience, even with his own work, can be described then without resorting to formula that depend on an unexamined assumption of ontological stability, e.g. the zeitgeist, the history of ideas, life and times. Instead, we are able to read Renan as a writer doing something describable in a place defined temporally, spatially, and culturally, hence archivally. For an audience, and no less important for the furtherance of his own position in the Orientalism of his era, Renan came to Orientalism from philology, and it is the extraordinarily rich and celebrated cultural position of that discipline that endowed Orientalism with its own important technical characteristics. For anyone to whom the word philology suggests dry as dust and inconsequential word study, however, Nietzsche's proclamation that along with the greatest minds of the 19th century, he is a philologist will come as a surprise. Though not if Balzac's Louis Lambert is recalled. Well, a marvellous book one would write by narrating the life and adventures of a word. Undoubtedly, a word has received various impressions of the events which it was used, depending on the places it was used. A word has awakened different kinds of impressions in different people, but is it not more grand still to consider a word in the triple aspect of soul, body, and movement? What is the category, Nietzsche will ask later, that includes himself, Wagner, Schopenhauer, Leopardi as all philologists? The term seems to include both a gift for exceptional spiritual insight into language and the ability to produce work whose articulation is of aesthetic and historic power. Although the profession of philology was born the day in 1777 when F.A. Wolf invented for himself the name of stud philo, Nietzsche is nevertheless at pains to show that professional students of the Greek and Roman classics are commonly incapable of understanding their discipline. They never reach the roots of the matter. They never adduce philology as a problem, but simply as knowledge of the ancient world, philology cannot, of course, last forever. Its material is inexhaustible. It is this that the herd of philologists cannot understand, but what distinguishes the few exceptional spirits who Nietzsche deems worthy of praise, not unambiguously, and not in the cursory way that I am now describing, is their profound relation to modernity, a relation that is given them by their practice of philology. Philology problematizes itself, its practitioner, the present, embodies a peculiar notion of being modern and European, since neither of those two categories has a true meaning without being related to an earlier alien culture and time. What Nietzsche also sees as philology as something born, made in the Baconian sense as a sign of human enterprise, created as a category of human discovery, self-discovery, and originality. Philology is a way of historically setting oneself off, as great artists do, from one's time, and as an immediate past, even as, paradoxically and etymologically one actually characterizes one's modernity by doing so. Between the Friedrich August Wolff of 1777 and the Friedrich Nietzsche of 1875, there was Ernest Renan, an Oriental philologist, also a man with a complex and interesting sense of the way philology and modern culture are involved in each other. In L'Avenir de la Science, written in 1848 but not published until 1890, he wrote that the founders of modern mind are philologists. And what is modern mind? He said in the preceding sentence, if not rationalism, criticism, liberalism, all of which were founded on the same day as philology. Philology, he goes on to say, is both a comparative discipline, persists only by moderns, and as a symbol of modern and European superiority. Every advance made by humanity since the 15th century can be attributed to minds we should call philological. The job of philology in modern culture, as culture and non-calls philological, is to continue to see reality and nature clearly, thus driving out supernaturalism and to continue to keep pace with discoveries in the physical sciences. But more than all of this, philology enables a general view of human life and of the system of things, me being there at the centre, inhaling the perfume of everything, judging, comparing, combining, inducing. In this way, I shall arrive at the very system of things. There is an unmistakable aura of power about the philologist, and Renan makes his point about philology and the natural sciences. Now he quotes Renan, to do philosophy is to know things. Following Cuvier's nice phrase, philosophy is instructing the world in theory. Like Kant, I believe that every purely speculative demonstration has no more validity than a mathematical demonstration and can teach us nothing about existing reality. Philology is the exact science of mental objects. La philologie est la science exacte des choses des esprits. It is to the sciences of humanity what physics and chemistry are to the philosophic science of bodies. So that bit on Renan, so as we can see, again, Said absolutely railing against the practice of philology, and his main beef of it, again, seems to be this idea that it's a modern rational construct that's used to kind of invade and sort of try to take over and understand other cultures as if it's some invasive force. I want to just, because I mentioned it in the last stream, again, where I mentioned this tension between literary criticism and language study, that, J.R.R. Tolkien was a philologist and a language scholar. When I look at someone like Tolkien, yes, he was a man of the modern time, but as a philologist, he was someone who was obsessed with trying to understand the origins of the English language, because he was invested, in his own culture and wanted to try and understand it better and try to recapture something of the lost mythical past. So one aspect of philology I'm thinking of is perhaps when we're looking at people like Renan and using philology to try and understand other cultures, perhaps they're doing what Tolkien was doing, but rather they're just trying to understand this other culture from its sort of etymological roots than their own culture. I mean, what do you think, Hunger?
No, I think Said's problem with philology, more broadly, is the postmodern critique of language. Like, what is the postmodern critique of language? It goes back to the relationship between language and truth. Like, we can't understand truth outside of language. And what is the job of the philologist? The philologist is to study language and how the language forms. And so because we have no other ways of communicating without language, we can't really know the truth outside of language. And what Said does, and what I find dishonest, is that he himself is putting himself in the objective position, where it's like the language you use is subjective. The language you use has a background and a baggage that brings with it certain biases and certain ways of thinking. And the problem with that is that he's trying to be objective, whereas he's not objective. No, if you take this critique to its logical conclusion, no one is objective. Said is looking at this problem from it's the view from nowhere. It's like, because I'm not studying this language, I'm not using this language. I have the view from nowhere, and therefore I'm being objective. But Said does not have a view from nowhere. He's not objective. He has his own background. He has his own baggage and his own understanding. And so at the end of the day, it's dishonest. I don't know how else to say it, but it goes back to what do you think about that first of all, the postmodern critique of language, because that's what Said is really getting at.
I suppose in a postmodern sense, I guess I'm a bit more sympathetic to what he's saying, but ultimately, again, it is disingenuous because the study of language isn't just a postmodern construct. As I said, philology has a powerful role in looking back and trying to understand the origins of one's own language, vis-a-vis the work of Tolkien. And I mentioned earlier that the 19th century, this was a time of Romanticism. So again, philology, okay, he clearly thinks it's a subversive practice, but it can also be used for much good, as we saw with Tolkien.
I mean, my big issue with Said is that in all of his statements, he never gets to the truth of the matter. Like, is what the philologist saying true or not? And the reason why he doesn't say whether it's true or not is because, one, he doesn't care. Two, I don't think he knows I don't think he has a perspective on like what is true. Like we're gonna talk about this later on when we get to the afterword of the book. But the entire purpose of Orientalism in his writing is Orientalism is the Western perspective of the Arabs. But he never tells us, as an Arab himself, what is an Arab? What is the origin of the Arabic language? He never categorizes or describes or gives a positive vision of any of the things he's commenting on. It's a pure deconstructive work. Like if we had to do the work of de Sacy and Renan and actually tell people what are the Arabs, what is Arabic, how did it come into being, he would have to do what they're doing. He would have to do the same work that they're doing. But he criticizes them for doing the work itself, whereas he does not. He is a literary critic and cultural commentator, so he does not have to. He purposefully does not put himself in that position of authority, and so I can't take anything he says with much seriousness because he never actually issues a positive statement.
No, and another thought that's just come to my mind is I see a weird sort of parallel with our modern times in this hatred of this. It's almost like he's saying, I'm a Middle Easterner, I'm an Arab, you're a white European. How dare you study the culture and heritage of my people when I know nothing about it? If he was around now, I guarantee you he would be, accusing people of like cultural appropriation or other bullshit like that. How dare you like borrow this? How dare you study this?
I mean, I think it's rich that he says like, oh, philology is where philology brings in with it rationalism and modernism and liberalism, whereas he is a modern liberal rationalist himself. This is mind-boggling. Like, and because he never puts forward a positive identity, because he never says anything, he never says he never articulates what is an Arab, what is Arabic. He gets away with it. He gets away with it because he's never describing anything. So nothing he says has any substance to it. And it's not that Said isn't a very intelligent man. It's not that he isn't a very accomplished academic. It's that he says nothing of substance that isn't deconstructive.
Yeah, I hate to bring up Tolkien again, but what does he say? Evil cannot create; it can only destroy.
Indeed.
Many such cases. Right.
Yes.
Okay. So I think that's the so de Sacy and Renan commentaries, the bulk of part 2. So I just want to do a couple of other little points before we move on to part 3. So a couple of pages after what I just read, Said does something incredible and does an an incredibly bold-faced and unfair criticism of Thomas Carlyle. So it's only a small paragraph, but I'm going to read it in full because it has to be heard. So, a non-professional analogue to Cousin's Muhammad is Carlyle's, a Muhammad forced to serve a thesis totally overlooking the historical and cultural circumstances of the prophet's own time and place. Although Carlyle quotes Sussy, his essay is clearly the product of someone arguing for some general ideas on sincerity, heroism, and prophethood. His attitude is salutary. Muhammad is no legend, no shameful sensualist, no laughable petty sorcerer who trained pigeons to pick peas out of his ear. Rather, he is a man of real vision and self-conviction, albeit an author of a book, the Quran, that is a wearisome, confused jumble, crude, incondite, endless iterations, long-windedness, entanglement, most crude, incondite, insupportable stupidity, in short. Not a person of lucidity and stylistic grace himself, Carlyle asserts these things as a way of rescuing Muhammad from the Benthamite standards that would have condemned both Muhammad and him together. Yet Muhammad is a hero, transplanted into Europe out of the same barbaric Orient found wanting by Lord Macaulay in his famous Minutes of 1835, in which it was asserted that our native subjects have more to learn from us than we do from them. I mean, to imply that Thomas Carlyle is not a lucid and stylistic writer is complete projection from Said. And also this, again, this is what also astounds me, is that he points out, because he mentions Benthamite, so that's an allusion to Jeremy Bentham, the famous liberal and utilitarian scholar, and that's something I've been meaning to bring up. Like, we're talking about rationalism, we're talking about liberalism, and you're talking about the practical British versus the idealistic French. Well, one of the key thinkers of the British pragmatic mind is Jeremy Bentham, because he was the founder of utilitarianism, and he's right. The utilitarians would have condemned Carlyle, and it's funny because Carlyle was best friends with John Stuart Mill, who was Jeremy Bentham's student, and famously they had a falling out over some of Carlyle's views, especially on things like slavery. But it's amazing that Said can see that Carlyle is no friend of people like de Saussure or Renan or these sort of rational scientists or scholars, what have you, but yet he still has to attack and destroy his legacy all the same, even though Carlyle champions Muhammad and probably rescued his reputation in the West.
Absolutely. And Carlyle, Carlyle's writing, it's a heroic religious writing. Like there's the strong Protestant Calvinist flair within Carlyle that has a respect for, I would say, I don't want to say radicalism, but there's a respect for the religious impulse that the Muslims clearly had, that Europe was losing at the time of Carlyle's writing, and he respects that, and he resuscitates, like as you said, he resuscitates the image of Muhammad by comparing him to Cromwell, and that they were very, very, very similar figures in the way they created their state or empire in the case of the caliphate. But yes, and he impugns negative connotations to what Carlyle is doing, and I'm just like, why? Like for what reason? Just because Carlyle was a white European man, that he's not allowed to comment positively on Muhammad? I don't understand his critique. I don't.
And just to add to that, I just want to read this brief quote of Carlyle from The Hero's Prophet. So this is Carlyle talking about Islam. A false man found a religion. Why, a false man cannot build a brick house. If he do not know and follow truly the properties of mortar, burnt clay, and what else he works in, it is no house that he makes, but a rubbish heap. It will not stand for 12 centuries to lodge 180 millions. It will fall straight away. So there, Carlyle is defending Islam against criticism from Western scholars, arguing that it is clearly a genuine religious force that has stood the test of time, and it's something that should be feared and respected.
Yes, and it has a structure to it that it created when Islam broke out of the classical pseudomorphosis. it flowered into its own civilization that had these amazing accomplishments and conquered literally a third of the world, from Morocco all the way to Southeast Asia. I mean, this is astonishingly impressive, and he gives it his due that Islam was the foundation of this empire, and that without Muhammad and his without the personality of Muhammad and his influence, this would not have happened. This was a heroic age where empire was born in the Middle East and in North Africa. And Said just waves his hand away and says, "It doesn't matter what Carlyle thinks. I don't understand. I don't understand it." You would think he would have. You would think being a pro. You would think being an ethno-narcissist and supporting your own people. I mean, Said was not a Muslim, but he was an Arab, and the entire Islamic Golden Age was an Arab accomplishment. And you would think he would respect that, but he doesn't. And it's why I think that's dishonest, or at least, if not dishonest, it's at least extremely uncharitable.
No, absolutely. And right, so that was the brief bit on Carlyle. I now want to go forward to his commentary on Richard Burton, and just to clarify, so this is not the modern Welsh actor Richard Burton who married Elizabeth Taylor. This is the 19th century British sort of adventurer and traveller and writer Richard Burton. So I'm just going to read this little bit on Burton. So, as a traveller, Burton was a real adventurer. As a scholar, he could hold his own with any academic Orientalist in Europe. As a character, he was fully aware of the necessity of combat between himself and the uniformed teachers who ran Europe and European knowledge with such precise anonymity and scientific firmness. Everything Burton wrote testifies to this combativeness, rarely with more candid contempt for his opponents than in the preface to his translation of the Arabian Nights. He seems to have taken a special sort of infantile pleasure in demonstrating that he knew more than any professional scholar, that he had acquired many more details than they had, that he could handle the material with more wit and tact and freshness than they. As I said earlier, Burton's work based on his personal experience occupies a medium position between Orientalist genres, represented on the one hand by Lane and on the other hand by French writers I have discussed. His Oriental narratives are structured as pilgrimages, and in the case of The Land of Midian Revisited, pilgrimages for a second time to sites of sometimes religious, sometimes political and economic significance. He is present as the principal character of these works, as much the centre of fantastic adventure and even fantasy, like the French writers, as the authoritative commentator and detached Westerner on Oriental society and customs, like Lane. He has been rightly considered the first in a series of fiercely individualistic Victorian travellers in the East, the others being Blunt and Doughty, by Thomas Assad, who bases his work on the distance in tone and intelligence between his writer's work and such works as Austin Layard's Discoveries in the Ruins of Nineveh and Babylon, 1851. Eliot Warburton celebrated The Crescent and the Cross, 1844. Robert Curzon's Visit to the Monasteries of the Levant, 1849. And a work he does not mention, Thackeray's moderately amusing notes of a journey from Cornhill to Grand Cairo, 1845. Yet Burton's legacy is more complex than individualism, precisely because in his writing we can find exemplified the struggle between individualism and a strong feeling of national identification with Europe, specifically England, as an imperial power in the East. Assad sensitively points out that Burton was an imperialist for all his sympathetic self-association with the Arabs, but what is more relevant is that Burton thought of himself both as a rebel against authority, hence his identification with the East as a place of freedom from Victorian moral authority, and as a potential agent of authority in the East. It is in the manner of that coexistence between two antagonistic roles for himself that is of interest. And so I find this really remarkable, as I really think Said is projecting his own insecurities onto Burton here, because I've said in the stream and I've said before that I believe Said has a profound identity crisis. I mean, he cannot internally reconcile his Arab heritage with this modern, rational Europe, sort of Western intellectual heritage that he's been raised in, and he tries to place this onto Burton, who trying to argue that Burton is torn between his native Britain and the Orient, and he's sort of torn between the two, and I just think that's utter projection.
I've not read Burton, but he does this sort of mind reading on many of the authors and writers he criticizes, like Lane, for example. This passage on Lane, it's a very he dedicates 5 pages in the book to Lane's what is the title of the book? It's Manners and Customs. Yeah, Manners and Customs of the Modern Egyptians. So in the I'm not going to read the entire section, but in these 5 pages he devotes to the modern customs of the customs and traditions of modern Egypt. He shits on Lane, this British author who went to Egypt, lived in Egypt for many years. This was during the Egyptian Ottoman War, when Egypt gained its independence under Muhammad Ali Pasha, when they broke away from the Ottoman Empire and became an autonomous state. He shits on Lane for his book, where it's like, oh, you are part of this. Even though you lived there, and even though you had this experience of 5 years living with the locals, speaking with the locals, studying Arabic, writing down the customs, he details in the book. He details the Egyptian culture from in the life of a modern Egyptian. He details the culture from the birth of an Egyptian to the death rituals of the Egyptians, and he's just needlessly critical of it, despite the very real observable observations he made, and he impugns these negative motives that it's like, oh, you're speaking with this. It's all the same criticism. He just repeats the same problems, that you're a European, you're speaking with this authority about the East, and even though you saw or experienced these things, it doesn't really matter because Orientalism. But I'm trying not to be unfair to Said, but that's the impression I get throughout the book on the many writers and intellectuals he critiques.
Yes, he has a tendency to psychologize everyone, doesn't he? And though it didn't come up in that passage, elsewhere in the book, he also has a problem with Burton's, shall we say, sexual proclivities, because Burton was a translator, and he translated a lot of Oriental works into English. So famously, he did the, as Said mentioned, he did the Arabian Nights. And specifically relating to sexual practices, he translated the Kama Sutra into English, and he also translated, there's an Arab text which is very similar to the Kama Sutra. I think it's called The Perfumed Garden or something, and it's basically called like the Arab Kama Sutra. So we can see that he had a bit of an interest in sort of sexual literature. And also another thing that's really wild about Burton that I discovered, because I didn't know of him before reading this book, is he also came up with this concept called the Sotadic Zone, where he basically says that the Mediterranean and the Middle East is the endemic zone of male sodomy and sexual degeneracy, which I can kind of understand it for the Middle East, though I think the wider Mediterranean is a little bit unfair if you're going to include them in that.
I can understand that. I mean, speaking of, I hate talking about this, but speaking of sodomy, if you're aware of God, what's that economist's name? Very famous British economist.
John Maynard
early
Keynes,
20th century. Keynes.
Yeah,
he had his he had his visits to Egypt and Tunisia, where he participated in some unsavory activities with certain males or certain young males in the Middle East. So this was not, how do I say it? Like, this was not artificial. Like, these people wrote about it. These people observed it and studied it, and that this obviously came from maybe it might not have been organic, but it was certainly there, and it certainly wasn't a European importation, that these things were happening and that they had these sexual mores that very much contradicted Islam, but absolutely existed. And I blame this on the decline of the Muslim empires. I mean, if you look at the Middle East in the early 1800s and 1900s, this was the far end of the winter of the Magian civilization. The peak of the peak of the Magian civilization was either Harun al-Rashid in the early 800s, or the peak of the Islamic Golden Age, which is the 12th century. So we are centuries away removed from the peak of these incredible civilizations and intellectual culture and art and history, and you have these degenerate practices that come up 500 years after the end of the Islamic Golden Age. It's like, I'm not surprised these things exist, but to impugn that, I don't even understand what Said is trying to impugn, that the European has a sexualized view of the Arabs. I think that's true. I think you can find that in a lot of writing, especially in we'll talk about him, Flaubert. Flaubert was a very swarthy Frenchman who did many of these same things.
We discussed him last time because we discussed him last time. Remember this slide with the the Egyptian dancers and Huchak Kanem.
Oh yeah, absolutely. These things existed, but I think from my perspective, they came because it was the winter of the civilization. So obviously there was this degeneracy going on, even though it was a nominally Muslim religious society. And I don't think he takes that into account at all.
No, not at all. And okay, are there any final comments on part 2, or should we move on to part 3?
Nope, go ahead.
Okay. Right, so part 3, Said titles Orientalism Now. And with this, he's mostly dealing with what he calls Orientalism from the time of the 20th century. So before now, he was dealing with the late 18th and the early 19th century. So very much beforehand, it was very British and French influence. But as we're getting into the modern times, we start to see the British and the French phase out as their colonial empires disintegrate and the Americans come in. And I just want to highlight this comment from Namio Kazan. The Arabs in East Africa refused to fight for the Germans due to the fact that von Lettow-Vorbeck forbade them to bring their young boy sexual slaves. Oh, thank you for bringing that up. But funnily enough, I have actually read my reminiscence of East Africa, and I've been covering that as a stream with Marcus, and I still need to do part 2. And I don't recall him bringing that up actually, von Lettow-Vorbeck in the book. I don't know. Maybe my mind blacked it out.
Absolute degeneracy. I condemn.
Oh yes, but was it Andrew Hunger 2023? Speaking of sodomy.
Yeah. Oh God. Why do you put me in these positions? I do not want to speak about Arab sodomy. Sorry, very, very briefly off tangent. This reminded me. I had a very good conversation with a friend, an American friend 2 years ago, where I explained to him why sodomy is absolutely widespread throughout Saudi Arabia, and he was absolutely shocked by my my sociological analysis. I don't want to get into it right now, but I'll probably tell you about it off stream. Like, how does this extremely conservative, restrictive society have so much sodomy within it? We'll talk about that later. I do not want to talk about that on stream.
Yes, we've already said that word too much, I think. So let's move on. So, So
agreed.
So with Orientalism now. So in terms, obviously, Said is focuses on literary figures, but one of the main villains of the modern Orientalism is Joseph Conrad, of all people. And I always found it very weird why he picked Conrad, because if you want my opinion, I've not read any of his works, but I'm tangentially aware of Heart of Darkness, his most famous novel, and what it's about. And to me, Conrad always seemed to be someone who was kind of very critical of European attitudes and colonialism. So it just seems strange to me that Said would attack someone who was, at least critical. And I just want to read this little quote Said has included of Conrad from Heart of Darkness, which is actually in the introductory bit of part 3. The conquest of the earth, which mostly means taking it away from those who have a different complexion or slightly flatter noses than ourselves, is not a pretty thing when you look into it too much. What redeems it is the idea only, an idea at the back of it, not a sentimental pretense, but an idea, and an unselfish belief in the idea, something you can set up and bow down to and offer a sacrifice to. So what did you want to add?
No, I think Conrad was. I think there's a lot of good in that statement. I mean, what I have not read Heart of Darkness, but like as you are, I am aware of it, and I think this one line he says in Heart of Darkness, where it's like, it's the both the colonized and the colonizer is degrading to the soul, in that this having this master servant relationship is degrading to both partners. I think he's talking about India. This might be another writer, but it was specifically talking about the British relationship to the Indians and how it restricted these individuals into these roles of, master and servant, and that it was corrosive to sympathy, I guess. But that's what I wanted to add to that very briefly.
Oh, thank you. And well, I think that might be Orwell you're talking of, because there was a very famous George Orwell quote about that, because Orwell served in the Burmese police force in the 1920s, and I'm just trying to remember the exact quote, but but Orwell once said, as the white man, you wear this like mask of the tyrants, or the mask of the Sahib, this Eastern tyrant, and your face grows to fit it. So yes, Orwell very much believed in this sort of degradation of Western man as a colonizer.
No, you're right. You're right. I think it was Orwell, but I think Orwell was very inspired by Conrad.
It was not long after. So right, okay, and so in this bit, Said gets into some criticism of Altar de Gobineau, which I think is quite understandable considering Gobineau's views on race. So I just want to read this little bit on Gobineau. So, okay. So the thesis of Oriental backwardness, degeneracy, and inequality with the West most easily associated themselves early in the 19th century with ideas about the biological basis of racial inequality. Thus, the racial classifications found in Cuvier's Le Règne animal and Gobineau's Essai sur l'inégalité des races humaines and Robert Knox's The Dark Races of Man found a willing partner in latent Orientalism. To these ideas was added second-order Darwinism, which seemed to accentuate the scientific validity of the division of races into advanced and backward, or European, Aryan, and Oriental African. Thus, the whole question of imperialism, as it was debated in the late 19th century by pro-imperialists and anti-imperialists alike, carried forward the binary typology of advanced and backward or subject races, cultures, and societies. John Westlake's chapters on the principles of international law, 1894, argues, for example, that regions of the earth designated as uncivilized, a word carrying the freight of Orientalist assumptions, among others, ought to be annexed or occupied by advanced powers. Similarly, the ideas of such writers as Karl Peters, Leopold de Sassir, and Charles Temple draw on the advanced backward binarism, so essentially advocating in the late 19th century Orientalism. With all other peoples, variously designated as backward, degenerate, uncivilized, and retarded, the Orientals were viewed in a framework constructed out of biological determinism and moral political admonishment. The Oriental was linked thus to elements in Western society, delinquents, the insane, women, the poor, having in common an identity best described as lamentably alien. When Orientals were rarely seen or looked at, they were seen through, analysed not as citizens or even people, but as problems to be solved or confined, or as the colonial powers openly coveted their territory taken over. The point is that the very designation of something as Oriental involves an already pronounced evaluative judgment. In the case of the peoples inhabiting the decayed Oriental Empire, Ottoman Empire, an implicit program of action. Since the Oriental was a member of the subject race, he had to be subjected. It was that simple. The locus classicus for such judgment and action is to be found in Gustave Le Bon's Les lois psychologiques de l'évolution des peuples in 1894. So this idea of racial inequality, or the Westerners seeing the East in this way, so as he mentions the Gobineau's inequality of the human races there. So I've not read that book, though I am secondhand aware of it because Academic Agent covers de Gobineau in his book The Prophets of Doom, and de Gobineau is very, I think, unfairly categorized, and AA covers that in Prophets of Doom. Basically, de Gobineau is categorized as some like insanely like white supremacist racist and an inspiration for the mid-century Germans, but AA argues that Gobineau is actually a lot more nuanced than that, and his view of race is actually very complicated because he basically breaks race down into three categories. You've got the white, the yellow, and the black, but they don't quite correspond to what you would think, because an AA actually comes up with his own terms for these. So we could think of the white as chivalric, the yellow as practical, and the black as primal. So, for example, with the primal race, that race has all of the vital artistic energy, and the practical are very utilitarian, and you'll see the white chivalric, they're very brave and honourable. And he says that all people, to some extent, are at least a mixture of these two different groups. And basically, Gobineau's view as a prophet of doom is that the sort of chivalric quality in the human race in these different peoples has declined over modern generations, and we're seeing this increase of the pragmatic race. And so again, Said, I think, is being very uncharitable towards a lot of these people, but also specifically talking about the Orient. But de Gobineau was someone who was actually fascinated with the Orient. He was actually the French ambassador to Iran, and he was obsessed with the history of ancient Persia, and he was had incredibly high respect for Iranians. So what did you want to come in with?
Well, two things. I mean, just on the topic of the races. If you want real hardcore racism, ask a North African about the Sub-Saharans and see what the North Africans say about the Sub-Saharans. Excuse me. That would be one. He never talks about. He never mentions the Arab views on the other races for obvious reasons. They're not always positively. They don't view every race positively. I'll just say that. The second thing, I 100% agree. Gobineau was much more nuanced in his categorizations, and he has this one passage about the French Revolution where he literally describes the Parisian peasants and the countryside as a different race than the elite royalist families. And he literally describes them as a different race, and that the French Revolution was a racial conflict, not an socioeconomic conflict, like a Marxist would argue.
Yeah, no, I am aware of that, and I do want to get around to reading Gobineau directly one day, because that sounds like a fascinating book, and I actually think his analysis can be looked at with other countries as well. But I just want to move on. So obviously we've done a stream before Hunger discussing Spengler's concept of Magian civilization, and what's really frustrating with Said again is that he mentioned Spengler very briefly, and it's so frustrating that I'm going to read this very small passage where he mentions Spengler, and it's annoying that he doesn't have more to say than this. I'm just going to bring it up. So the passage in question is this. So, transferred from an implicit social evaluation to a grandly cultural one, the static male Orientalism took on a variety of forms in the late 19th century, especially when Islam was being discussed. General cultural historians, as respected as Leopold von Ranke and Jacob Burckhardt, assailed Islam as if they were dealing not so much with an anthropomorphic abstraction as with a religio-political culture about which deep generalizations were possible and warranted. In his Weltgeschichte, 1881 to 1888, Ranke spoke of Islam as defeated by the Germanic Romanic peoples, and in his Historic Fragmente, unpublished notes 1893, Burckhardt spoke of Islam as wretched, bare, and trivial. Such intellectual operations were carried out with considerably more flair and enthusiasm by Oswald Spengler, whose ideas about a Magian personality, typified by the Muslim Oriental, infused the Untergang des Abendlandes, 1918 to 1922, and the morphology of cultures it advocates. And that's all Said has to say about Spengler, other than a brief line in the introduction where he alludes to a Spenglerian Orient. And, you know, you don't even need to read all of Decline of the West. You just need to read that segment we covered in our stream. That's like, 100 pages or so? And there's so much Said could have drawn on from this, but he doesn't fucking comment. It's so annoying.
I think he doesn't comment on it because I think there's very little to critique. I think the chapter on the problems of the Arabian culture, I mean, it's so fascinating, and it's so mind bending. You look at the Middle East in a completely different light. After I looked at my own culture and my background in a completely different light after reading Spengler, and I think he doesn't comment on it because it's very hard to critique, and he would have to reconcile his own problems with identity with that chapter on Spengler. Being a Western educated Protestant while having a Magian soul is not something I think he would like to deal with, and I think that's a problem for Said. I did want to mention, going back to Gobineau, one very brief thing. It's not a coincidence that the French had this fascination with Persia, whereas the English had this fascination with the Arabs, and the Turks and the Germans had a fascination with the Turks. And because they correspond to each other extremely well. The British and the Arabs were allies in World War One. The Germans and the Turks were allies in World War One, and the French and the Persians were also. I think they were allies, but maybe I don't know the extent of the Persian involvement in World War One. But these three cultures have something very in common. The British and the Arabs have a puritanical streak and have a practical capitalist economic mode of being. The French and the Persians have this extremely strong, high cultural and theoretical intellectual fascination, and the Germans and the Turks have this industriousness. That it's not a coincidence that these three cultures allied with their counterparts in the Middle East. The Turkish Arab Persian divide is extremely similar to the French British German divide, and the deeper you look into it, the more the parallels correspond.
I'm glad you brought that up, and but one thing I would say, AA has his own version of that, and I'm going to say I think I agree more with AA's version. So he would agree the French correspond to the Persians, but he swaps the Arab and the British and the Germans around. He argues the Turks are more like the British because the Turks are quite pragmatic in how they rule, which I agree, and the Germans are more like the Arabs because they're both very, shall we say, prone to militarism and, shall we say, quite passionate. And also, one thing I would add to that is, both were the source of what Arnold Toynbee calls a Volkerwanderung, a grand sort of a grand invading horde. So you've got the Germanic tribes that destroyed the Roman Empire, and then you've got the Arab Volkerwanderung that came out of the Arabian Peninsula and conquered the Middle East. So any sort of counterpoint to that, or?
I can see that, but I think AA is vastly underestimating Turkish militarism. I think of the three groups, the Turks were far more organized and far more competent in their military structure compared to the peoples they were fighting. I mean, look at the success of the Ottoman Empire. Whereas with the Arabian armies and the conquest of Arabia, it was very different. The Arabs were much more piratical in their military strategy than the Turks. The Turks had a functioning, organized, well-trained army that they had that warrior caste similar to the Prussians of Germany, and I think that corresponds better than the Arabs. Like Arabs and British are they're both piratical capitalist races. I'm not using capitalism in a negative connotation, but they're far more concerned about those kinds of things, in my opinion.
Well, that's a new level of kinship between me and you then.
Habibi.
Indeed. And another comment from Namia Al-Kazan. Syed is one of those Eastern intellectuals who, after benefiting from the West, decides to turn around and pin his achievements on his own culture, similarly to Lee Kuan Yew repudiation of Britain. Yes, I think he was the first president of Singapore. Yeah. I actually heard he was quite based.
Agreed. Absolutely. But yes, he's saying that the accomplishments of the British and the British organization, because the British organized Singapore to what it was, and they just what the post-colonial administrations did is just take over the institutions that were already built by the British, because those institutions did not exist in the form they did beforehand. Like the Egyptian military and the Egyptian state was modeled after the British colonial administration, because it created the state of modern Egypt from the ground up.
Absolutely, but I would say regarding the Singapore case, just as a brief tangent, one also must remember is that originally Singapore was part of the Federation of Malaya. It was part of Malaysia. One of the reasons it broke away is these ethnic tensions, because Singapore is effectively a Chinese ethno-colony in Malaysia. And because it has such a large population influence, the rest of Malaysia did not want to be dominated by this Chinese colony as a node of subversion, so they kicked it out.
For very understandable reasons. But yes, the expatriate Chinese were they were the Jews of Asia in every way, shape, and form, if you want to take it to that logical conclusion.
The Jews of Asia, that is a new expression I'm not going to forget.
Yes. The Chinese outside of China were a mercantile class that monopolized all the industries of the nations they landed in. They're the elite class of many of these South Asian states, like Singapore being the most famous and obvious example.
No, thank you. And right now to move on with the rest of part 3. So, okay, we've done the bit on Spengler. So, okay, next Said, I think, has a very unfair criticism. I say unfair, but I suppose it's to be expected. But he goes after Rudyard Kipling, because every post-colonial individual has to attack Kipling for obvious reasons. So I just want to read this little bit on Kipling. So, okay. As he appears in several poems, in novels like Kim, and in Too Many Catchphrases to Be an Ironic Fiction, Kipling's white man, as an idea, a persona, a style of being, seems to have served many Britishers while they were abroad. The actual colour of their skin set them off dramatically and reassuringly from the sea of natives, but for the Britisher, who circulated amongst Indians, Africans, or Arabs, there was also the certain knowledge that he belonged to and could draw upon the empirical spiritual reserves of a long tradition of executive responsibility towards the coloured races. It was of this tradition, its glories and difficulties, like Kipling wrote when he celebrated the road taken by the white man in the colonies. And in here he quotes Kipling directly. Now this is the road that the white men tread when they go to clean a land, iron underfoot and vine overhead, and the deep on either hand. We have trod that road, and a wet and windy road, our chosen star for guide. Oh well for the world when the white men tread the highway side by side. And now back to Said. Cleaning a land is best done by white men in delicate consort with each other, an allusion to the present dangers of European rivalry in the colonies. For failing in the attempt to coordinate policy, Kipling's white men are quite prepared to go to war. Freedom for ourselves and freedom for our sons, and failing freedom war. Behind the white man's mask of amiable leadership, there is always the express willingness to use force to kill and be killed. what dignifies his mission in some sense of intellectual dedication, he is a white man, but does not mere profit since he has chosen star, presumably sits far above earthly gain. Certainly, many white men often wondered what it was they fought for on that wet and windy road, and certainly a great number of them must have been puzzled as to how the colour of their skins gave them superior ontological status plus great power over much of the inhabited world. Yet in the end, being a white man for Kipling and for those whose perceptions and rhetoric he influenced was a self-confirming business. One became a white man because one was a white man. More important, drinking that cup, living that unalterable destiny in the white man's day, left one little time for idle speculation on origins, causes, and historical logic. So Said there obviously really focuses on the sort of the ethnic argumentation of Kipling, especially his idea of white man, or very famously in his poem, The White Man's Burden. Again, Kipling was speaking from a racial perspective, but I think also that Kipling was trying to give some sense of purpose to what the white man was doing. So he was, I guess it links back to the idea of what Disraeli said in Tancred: the East is a career, or not really a career, but an adventure. There's an opportunity for these men to do something productive and adventurous with their time. What do you want to come in with?
No, I think that's very interesting, and I'm not surprised by Said's criticism. And it ties back into Conrad's Heart of Darkness, where the European man going out on these adventures, like at first, this is an interesting facet that I don't think Said explores at all. That it's the explorers, it's the high testosterone European explorers who go to the foreign lands and then conquer these territories, and then afterwards the bureaucratic European administrations have to follow them. It's not that the state invades India, or that the state invades these foreign colonies. It's that the adventurers and these men who accomplish great things and do discover the world, then the state follows them afterwards. Not even, so in many cases, against their own will. In many cases, this was not intentional, but because the state and the bureaucracy has to follow them, and now that has to govern this land that these explorers had conquered and found, they need a political formula to justify their presence in that territory and their presence among the foreign peoples. And that's what Kipling is trying to justify. He's trying to find a political formula and a reason for the existence of the British in India, or the existence of the British in the Middle East. And it goes, and when that passage that Said quotes from Conrad, it's about the idea, and the idea needs to move men and have men worship this idea to justify their existence in this land or territory. That could be that idea could be Faustian, but in many of the cases, that idea was, we are bringing civilization to these countries that are very economically poor in comparison to Europe, very economically poor, very culturally different, that have these quote unquote barbaric practices that must be stopped for the sake of a Christian morality. And I don't think Said is wrong in criticizing that. I just think he's not fair-handed in his. You can take it very cynically that this was a justification. All political formulas are justifications for power, and that's the root of the Foucauldian and the Foucauldian and the Gramscian technique. That's what Gramsci and Foucault hit upon. That these are all, ideology is meaningless. It's all just justifications for power. And I think Said is right to draw on that tradition and that criticism.
Thank you. And so just talking about Kipling, what I find interesting as well is obviously he focuses on the idea of the white man or the white man's burden. But there's actually another very famous poem by Kipling, which he completely ignores, because actually you could argue a kind of a respectful or positive interpretation of an Oriental, and it's Kipling's poem Gunga Din, which is about this Indian kind of like soldier that fights in the British colonial armies. And I just want to read a little bit from Gunga Din just to give you an example. So this is the last bit of the poem. So he carried me away to where a dooley lay, and a bullet come and drilled the beggar clean. He put me safe inside, and just before he died, I hope you like your drink, says Gunga Din. So I'll meet him later on, and at the place where he is gone, where it's always double drill and no canteen. He'll be squatting on the coals, giving drink to poor damn souls, and I'll get a swig in hell from Gunga Din. Yes, din, din, din. You, Lazarushian leather Gunga Din, though I've belted you and flayed you by the living God that made you, you're a better man than I, Gunga Din. So you can see there that despite this kind of cultural difference, and there's an implicit hierarchy, he talks about belting and flaying him, there is a respect and this mutual admiration between the narrator of this poem and this Indian Gunga Din.
I think there's an even stronger case than that. I mean, you can argue that you could argue that this poem by Kipling is he's giving this respect to this Indian soldier because he's serving British interests. But an even stronger case than that one would be the European writings on Saladin. How do the Europeans always describe Saladin in the fight against the Crusaders? That he is a noble, worthy knight and adversary, that he was this great conqueror, and that he led his people and he did what was best for his people, and he was such an upstanding moral character, even though he was a heathen and he followed in the perspective of the Europeans, he followed a satanic imposture religion that had this enormous respect for his value and virtue and honor on the battlefield. And I think that's far more indicative of a European respect for an Arab and for an Oriental man, someone who's worthy of admiring, even if they're not from that culture.
No, thank you for bringing that up. Okay, is there any final comment you want to make on Kipling before we move on?
No.
Right. Okay, so after Kipling, then of course Said then lays his eyes on T.E. Lawrence, or Lawrence of Arabia, and so I'm just going to do another little reading regarding Lawrence. So, okay. Right. Okay. The defeat of narrative by vision, which is true even in so patently story-like a work as The Seven Pillars, is something we've already encountered in Lane's Modern Egyptians. A conflict between a holistic view of the Orient, description, monumental record, and a narrative of events in the Orient is a conflict on several levels, involving several different issues. As the conflict is frequently renewed in the discourse of Orientalism, it is worthwhile analysing it here briefly. The Orientalist surveys the Orient from above, with the aim of getting hold of the whole sprawling panorama before him: culture, religion, mind, history, society. To do this, he must see every detail through the device of a set of reductive categories: the Semites, the Muslim mind, the Orient, and so forth. Since these categories are primarily schematic and efficient ones, since it is more or less assumed that no Oriental can know himself the way an Orientalist can, any vision of Orient ultimately comes to rely for its coherence and force on the person, institution, or discourse whose property it is. Any comprehensive vision is fundamentally conservative, and we have noted how in the history of ideas about the Near Orient in the West, these ideas have maintained themselves regardless of any evidence disputing them. Indeed, we can argue that these ideas produce evidence that produces their validity. The Orientalist is principally a kind of agent of such comprehensive visions. Lane is a typical instance of the way an individual believes himself to have subordinated his ideas, or even what he sees, to the exigencies of some scientific view of the whole phenomenon, known collectively as the Orient, or the Oriental nation. A vision, therefore, is static, just as the scientific categories informing late 19th century Orientalism are static. There is no recourse beyond the Semites or the Oriental mind. These are final terminals holding every variety of Oriental behaviour, within the general view of the whole field. As a disciple, as a profession, as specialized language or discourse, Orientalism is staked upon the permanence of the whole Orient, for without the Orient there can be no consistent, intelligible, and articulated knowledge called Orientalism. That the Orient belongs to Orientalism, just as it is assumed that there is a pertinent information belonging to or about the Orient. Against this static system of synchronic essentialism, I've called vision, because it presumes that the whole Orient can be seen panoptically. There was a constant pressure. The source of pressure is narrative, in that if any Oriental detail can be shown to move or to develop, diachrony is introduced into the system. What seems stable, and the Orient is synonymous with stability and unchanging internality, now appears unstable. Instability suggests that history, with its disruptive detail, its currents of change, its tendency towards growth, decline, or dramatic movement, is possible in the Orient and for the Orient. History and the narrative by which history is represented argue that vision is insufficient, that Orient, as an unconditional ontological category, does an injustice to the potential of reality for change. And this passage is so frustrating because, yes, I get he's got a critique of Lawrence, and you could argue that perhaps Lawrence was being a bit idealistic when he led the Arab revolt, but to say that the Orient is exempt from the patterns or course of history is absurd. Lawrence, for good or ill, was a great man, and he had a strong belief behind him and belief in the Arabs that followed him for that cause, for good or bad. And I just find it to be an incredibly nihilistic and anticlimactic view of history to deny such a thing.
Well, this might be actually our first disagreement on the streams, but I don't think. Well, first of all, yes, I think he is diminishing the role and the idea of Lawrence as a great man. That I think that's definitely true, but I don't think that Said is actually saying that the Arabs are exempt. I don't think he's saying the Arabs are exempt from history. Throughout the book, in multiple passages, he critiques the Western scholars, and especially the Western artists. When you had those streams on Oriental art with Mr. D, he always critiques the European artists and scholars for having a static view of the Arabs, that the Arab hasn't changed in the past 1,000 years of history, that there's this timeless quality in all the art, that because the Orient is a mysterious magical place, that it's forever unchanging, it's forever static, and I think that's what he actually rails against. What he's critiquing is, why can't the Islamic world or the Arab world change over time when you've had all these empires throughout its history that have changed, and that the people living in Egypt, for example, in 1850 are not the same Egyptians that lived in Egypt in 850. I think that's what he's actually hitting upon, that the European has the static view of the other, and that it has been forever unchanging. But the other side to that is he in that passage he criticizes essentialism. Like, the European is an essentialist when viewing the Arab. The Arab has this essential quality. The problem with Said is, like, he disagrees that the Arabs have an essence, which I think is totally wrong. I think there is an essence to Arab and Arabian culture. There is an essence there, and it comes mostly through Islam. That's where I see the biggest. That's where my biggest critique of him is. He never describes the essence of the Arab, because he doesn't agree with essentialism. But I think that's wrong.
Mm. No. I kind of get your counter argument. There's certainly a point there, and I would say, if we're talking about criticisms of Lawrence, we mentioned last time Eli Kaduri's The Chatham House version. I do remember the essay in there, and I think Kaduri has a criticism of Lawrence too, though I would argue Kaduri has a much, I think, more constructive and, I think, fair criticism of Lawrence. And I think I do actually agree with Kaduri that Lawrence was a dangerous idealist, but that's for another discussion on another day.
I just very briefly on that topic. Not just a dangerous idealist, but a very narcissistic. What's the right word? A very narcissistic adventurer who wanted fame and prestige among the among the British, specifically the high British government. He wanted to be a famous officer and wanted to have this grand adventure, and he had these romantic notions that, as Disraeli said, the Orient is a career, and Lawrence made his career by leading a group of Arabs against the Turks. But the best critique I ever heard of Lawrence of Arabia was this book. What's his name? God damn it! Who was the writer? Who was the author of Stalin's War? Prudentialist is doing a stream on it currently. Yes. McMeekin has an excellent book called The Ottoman Endgame, where he goes through the archival evidence. It's a great book. His chapter on Lawrence of Arabia it's devastating. It's devastating to the legacy of Lawrence. He doesn't outright call him a fraud, but he calls him vain. His number one concern is celebrity. The actual achievements of the British expedition in Arabia were nothing like what it was hyped up to be in the films. It was an excellent film, by the way. I love the David Lynch film. Fantastic film. But
you mean David Lean, says, not David Lynch.
Sorry, David Lean. Yes, amazing film. I love Lawrence of Arabia, the film. But McMeekin actually, he cites interviews with the King of Saudi Arabia at the time. I can't remember his name. Was it King Abdullah, or was it who was the first King of Saudi Arabia?
Ibn Saud.
Yes, it was with Ibn Saud. He quotes interviews with Ibn Saud where a British journalist was asking him, like, what was it like to fight alongside Lawrence of Arabia? Like, this was a grand adventure. Like, what was it like? And he says, like, the British journalist asks Ibn Saud, what do you remember most about Lawrence of Arabia? And Ibn Saud answers, he was the man with the gold. Full stop. He was the man with the gold. He just brought the gold that the British gave Lawrence to bribe the Arabs into war.
I mean, simple but true. Many subsidies were given to the Arabs. So,
yes, and the Arabs were being piratical peoples. They were playing both sides. They were saying, "Oh, my Sultan, yes, I am very loyal to you. I support the Caliphate. Just give me this, and that much gold, and you have my eternal loyalty." And then on the other hand, he was writing other letters to the British. Yes, we hate the Turks. We despise the Turks so much. We can't wait to be rid of their oppression. If you give me this, and much gold, I will start a rebellion tomorrow. On your word, on my honor. This was exactly what Ibn Saud was doing at the time of the First World War, playing both sides against each other to get the most gold out of both. And very cynical, but that's what the archives tell us what happened.
No, and it's also interesting because I mentioned earlier about this whole idea of the Ottomans launching a jihad. Well, that's actually the basis of another book by McMeekin called the Berlin-Baghdad Express, where he looks at the relationship and strategic partnership between Germany and the Ottomans that cultivated in that weird, the Kaiser simping for Islamic jihad. Again,
Wilhelm was an Islamophile. Very strangely, he was a very strange Islamophile.
Haji Wilhelm, but time to move on. So there's another bit I want to read where Syed talks about Orientalism in the interwar period. So this segment is actually called Modern Anglo-French Orientalism in Fullest Flower, Because we have become accustomed to think of a contemporary expert on some branch of the Orient or some aspect of its life as a specialist in area studies, we have lost a vivid sense of how, until around World War II, the Orientalist was considered to be a generalist with a great deal of specific knowledge, of course, who had highly developed skills for making summational statements. By summational statements, I mean that in formulating a relatively uncomplicated idea, say about Arabic grammar or Indian religion, the Orientalist would be understood and would understand himself as also making a statement about the Orient as a whole, thereby summing it up. Thus, every discrete study of a one bit of Oriental material would also conform in a summary way the profound Orientality of the material, and since it was commonly be believed that the whole Orient hung together in some profoundly organic way, it made perfectly good hermeneutical sense for the Orientalist scholar to regard the material evidence he dealt with as ultimately leading to a better understanding of such things as the Oriental character, mind's ethos, or world spirit. Most of the first two chapters of this book have made similar arguments about earlier periods in the history of Orientalist thought. The differentiation in its latter history that concerns us here, however, is the one between the periods immediately before and after World War I. In both instances, as with the earlier periods, the Orient is Oriental no matter the specific case, and no matter the style or technique used to describe it. The difference between the two periods in question is the reason given by the Orientalist for seeing the essential orientality of the Orient. A good example of the pre-war rationale can be found in the following passage by Schnock Hurgronje, taken from his 1899 review of Edward Sachschal's Mohammed Medanisches Recht. The law, which in practice had to make ever greater concessions to the use and customs of the people and the arbitrariness of their rulers, nevertheless retained a considerable influence on the intellectual life of the Muslims. Therefore, it remains and still is for us too an important subject of study, not only for abstract reasons connected with the history of law, civilization, and religion, but also for practical purposes. The more intimate the relations of Europe with the Middle East becomes, the more Muslim countries fall under the European suzerainty, the more important it is for us Europeans to become acquainted with the intellectual life, the religious law, and the conceptual background of Islam. Although Hurgronje allows that something so abstract as Islamic law did occasionally yield to the pressure of history and society, he is more interested than not in retaining the abstraction for intellectual use because, in its broad outline, Islamic law confirms this disparity between East and West. For Hurgronje, the distinction between Orient and Occident was no mere academic or popular cliché. Quite the contrary, for him, it signified the essential historical power relationship between the two. Knowledge of the Orient either proves, enhances, or deepens the difference by which European suzerainty, the phrase has a venerable 19th century pedigree, is extended effectively over Asia. To know the Orient as a whole, then, is to know it because it is entrusted to one's keeping if one is a Westerner. An almost symmetrical passage to Hurgronje's is to be found in the concluding passage of Gibbs' article Literature in the Legacy of Islam, published in 1931. After having described the free casual contacts between the East and West up to the 18th century, Gibbs then proceeds to the 19th century. Following on these 3 moments of casual contact, the German Romantics turned again to the East and for the first time made it their conscious aim to open a way for the real heritage of Oriental poetry to enter into the poetry of Europe. The 19th century, with its new sense of power and superiority, seemed to claim the gate decisively in the face of their design. Today, on the other hand, there are signs of a change. Oriental literature has begun to be studied again for its own sake, and under a new standing of the East is being gained. As this knowledge spreads and the East recovers its rightful place in the life of humanity, Oriental literature may once again perform its historic function and assist us to liberate ourselves from the narrow and oppressive conceptions which would limit all that is significant in literature, thought, and history to our own segment of the globe. Gibbs' phrase "for its own sake" is in diametrical opposition to the string of reasons subordinated to Hurgronje's declaration about European suzerainty over the Middle East. What remains, nevertheless, is that seemingly inviolable over all identity of something called the East and something else called the West. Such entities have a use for each other, and it is plainly Gibbs' laudable intention to show that the influence of Western on Oriental literature need not be, in its results, what Brunetière had called a national disgrace. Rather, the East could be confronted as a sort of humanistic challenge to the local confines of Western ethnocentricity. So, from that passage, what Said is basically arguing is Orientalism was taking on a more, what you might call, a not intellectual, but a humanistic sort of quality, an attempt to try and present itself as more humane and benign. And that's exemplified through the Orientalist Gibb, who I've got pictured. And I can actually attest to this a bit because I've mentioned before I'm familiar with Toynbee's study of history. Well, in the unabridged volume 1, Toynbee has a series of appendices, and one of the appendices deals with the creation of Safavid Iran and the conversion of Iran to Shiite Islam. Well, one of the appendices, Toynbee actually consulted Gibb for some advice and information, and Toynbee literally just printed this note from Gibb in this appendix to the study of history, and Gibb kind of gives this sort of elucidation as to why Iran is Shiite. And I won't quote it, but it was actually a really fascinating bit of text. And I think it really does. I do actually agree with Said that I think Gibb was trying to create a more, so I would say, sensible or humanistic face of study of the East.
No, I agree with that. I mean, we should actually talk about Gibb. He's a very important person in Orientalism, and Said explicitly criticizes him on many occasions in the last chapter of the book. Hamilton Alexander Gibb was a Scottish Orientalist. He was actually born and raised in Egypt. Alexandria, Egypt, at that time, at the beginning of the 20th century, was a very cosmopolitan, very European city. It's also the city where Filippo Marinetti was also born, the Italian futurists. So, but it was a very cosmopolitan city that had a lot of European influence and had a lot of European intellectuals born there. And what Gibb does, I think you're right. Yes, he was trying to put a more humane spin on Orientalism, but what Said is criticizing, as he's always criticizing, goes back to the one criticism that this is a Western man, and his intellectual work, especially on the literature of Arab poetry, was used to justify, or was used to pursue British interests and British suzerainty over the East. That's what Said is criticizing, and he says, and he hits on this with every single person he critiques in the book, and nothing new here. But I think Gibb is actually one, like John Bagot Glubb, because he's an early 20th century Orientalist. He's far more nuanced, and because he lived there and he had experiences in Egypt growing up, he understands Arabs far better than the Orientalists that came before him in the 1800s. And I want to read this very interesting passage from Gibb that Said cites in the book. I'm quoting Said right now. This is speaking on Gibb. It was believed then that for the Oriental, liberation, self-expression, and self-enlargement were not the issues that they were for the Occidental. Instead, the Islamic Orientalist expressed his ideas about Islam in such a way as to emphasize his, as well as putatively the Muslims, resistance to change. The Orientalist is always describing Islam as resistant to change, resistant to modernity, and I think that's a fair point. I think that's correct, actually. But continuing on, to mutual comprehension between East and West, to the development of men and women out of archaic, primitive, classical institutions and into modernity. Indeed, so fierce was this sense of resistance to change, and so universal were the powers ascribed to it, that in reading the Orientalists one understands that the apocalypse to be feared was not the destruction of Western civilization, but rather the destruction of the barriers that kept East and West from each other. When Gibb opposed nationalism in the modern Islamic states, he did so because he felt that nationalism would corrode the inner structures keeping Islam Oriental. The net result of secular nationalism would be to make the Orient no different from the West. Yet it is a tribute to Gibb's extraordinarily sympathetic powers of identification with an alien religion that he put his disapproval in such a way as to seem to be speaking for the Islamic Orthodox community. He's being sarcastic here. How much such pleading was a revision to the old Orientalist habit of speaking for the natives, and how much was it a sincere attempt at speaking in Islam's best interest, is a question whose answer lies somewhere between the two alternatives. So on one hand, he's criticizing Gibb because because he had very good, accurate writings about the Middle East and he understood Arab culture growing up there. He was very conscious and very aware of the differences between the Occident and the Orient. He was very conscious and aware of the differences between the East and the West. And he wrote about the differences between the East and the West. And he cites Islamic law as a huge factor in what separates these two peoples into completely different civilizations from each other. It's not just Islam itself as a religion. It's Islamic law that separates Arabs from Europeans who follow either Catholic doctrine or English common law in the case of the British. But on the other hand, and this is what's so annoying about Gibb. This was so annoying about Said speaking on Gibb, is that Gibb understands and recognizes that Islam has this resistance to modernity, and that if it were to become modern, it would become in the form of secular nationalism. And every state in the Middle East today is a secular nationalist country. And Gibb says this is wrong. This changes Islam. This is not authentic to its spirit, and this is modern. It should not. Why should every other society in the world become secular nationalists just like the Europeans? Why? But Said, being a secular nationalist, is like, why shouldn't we become secular nationalism, when he is arguing at the same time that European influence is bad and we should not follow European influence. We should not follow European taste and perspectives on the Middle East. Like, this is mind-bogglingly retarded. And what do you have to say about that?
No, I agree with you, and again, it just adds to the frustration of Edward Said. For one side of his mouth, he's besmirching Western intellectuals, but for the other side of his mouth, he's basically channeling all his work through the confines of Western intellectual tradition. It's just so two-faced of him.
I mean, he has admitted, like, you can find interviews of Said, like, on YouTube. They're good interviews. He's a much better speaker than he is a writer. I mean, shockingly, I had a moment where I was like, I could not reconcile the fact that I was watching an interview of his and he was so clear and so forthright and so straightforward in his facts and logic that I could not understand that this was the same person who wrote this book at all. I could not reconcile the two facts at all. They might as well be two completely different people. But he admits to being a secular nationalist. And in what way, shape, or form is this not a European mode of thinking? There is no history of secular nationalism in either the Middle East or in Islamic history at all until the 1870s. This is my frustration with him, and I can't get over it. Like, his mind is colonized by Western ideas and Western thinking because he is a Western intellectual with brown skin. And he's not even that brown. I apologize.
That interview you sent me, which I watched, he's not that brown. And also, I was surprised how American he sounds. Like, he just sounds like a Harvard, like, English professor. It really surprised me.
He has like the American 1950s accent. Like this, like he was a much younger man. This was a man born in the 20s. I think he was born in the 30s. He was a very young child when. Yeah, he was a very young child. He was young when the creation of Israel was. He was very young in 1948 when the state of Israel was created. He was living in Cairo with his family. They were never allowed to return home, obviously, after the creation of the state of Israel. But he grew up in English schools. He has a perfect 1950s American accent, and every word out of his mouth is Western intellectualism, and it's shocking. I have no words. It's I don't want to I do not want to be unfair to him, but he is an East Coast intellectual in every way, shape, or form.
No, absolutely. And then the last little bit I want to do for Orientalism now was after this bit on Gibb, he then gets into the post-war shift of Orientalism to being a more of an American phenomenon. And he largely focuses on the Cold War and the American support for Israel against, and often acting in Israeli interest against that of the Arabs and the Palestinians. And I've got this cartoon on the right, which is actually from the 1973 oil crisis, which happened as a result of the Yom Kippur War, when I think all the OPEC Middle Eastern countries stopped sending oil to the West, and it led to a lot of oil shortages. And Saeed talks about how in a lot of the cartoons demonizing Arabs that they're is actually really, this is something that I find really like contradictory that he states. He says that the Semitic features of the Arabs, because the Arabs are a Semitic people, is played up, like they're given hooked noses and are made quite devious. And you can kind of see it in this cartoon, and he sort of implies that the West basically did a bait and switch. They stopped demonizing Jews and now they demonize Arabs. And I just think, like, but the West is supporting Israel, though. Like, they're literal, like, Zionists. It's like, you know, I just find it very unconvincing. What do you think?
No, I mean, well, I think we're going to disagree there. I think that's a I wouldn't say profound, but that is a huge positive. I agree with that statement completely, because you have post World War II, like you have the bait and switch where anti-Semitism is basically outlawed throughout the Western world. I mean, it's literally outlawed in many European countries, and it's semi legally outlawed in the United States. And so it's not a coincidence that the Arabs became the acceptable target of this racialization. It was an acceptable target because I don't know how much we can say, but certain groups of people had control over American foreign policy. I mean, the Israel let's just say it. The Israel lobby had an enormous amount of control over American foreign policy, and so serving their own interests, they switched these racial caricatures over to a fellow Semitic people, the Arabs, because they became the acceptable target and because they were the ones fighting against the creation of the Jewish state. So it's not surprising. Like, he is right on that. He is absolutely right on that point, and I will give him all the credit in the world. The one thing Saeed is excellent on is the case for Palestine, is the Palestinian cause. He is very clear, very articulate, has all the facts and logic on his side when he talks about Palestine. But when he's critiquing European intellectuals, it just falls so flat on its face that the contrast is incredible.
No, thank you for that. And I can kind of see where you're coming from, but I don't know. I'm just so accustomed to him being an unrepentant, anti-Western hater for the sake of it. I'm just show blanket skepticism against everything he says now. So.
It pains me to agree with Edward Said on any issue, but he is when it comes to Palestine, he's 100% correct. But I did want to mention this cartoon briefly. The third man in the cartoon is obviously Richard Nixon. I believe the second man is Henry Kissinger, and we had a brief discussion a few days ago. You wanted to mention Kissinger for a brief moment and his contrast to Said.
And I will say though, I think the second figure is supposed to be Brezhnev, the Soviet premier.
Oh, okay.
Yeah, and then I think the guy to the left of Nixon, with Nixon's left or right, I think that's supposed to be Ted Heath, the British Prime Minister, because he would have been Prime Minister at the time, and the other fellow, I don't know who that is, but yes, Kissinger, because obviously sadly, in the past couple of days, we have lost Henry Kissinger, died at the ripe old age of 100. And so obviously Kissinger's been on a lot of our minds, and especially some of his very spicy quotes about his racial and ethnic heritage, or his lack of consideration for the people of his tribe, so to speak. And I just think it's astounding
if not for an accident of birth, I would have been anti-Semitic. You cannot trust the Israelis. Sorry, go on. I just had to hop in with that. Please continue.
Yes, and I just think that Kissinger, well, let's just compare him to Said. They're both not American by birth. They're both born, obviously Said is born in Palestine, and Kissinger is born in Germany, though of Jewish extraction, and they're both forced to flee. Kissinger's forced to flee because of the mid-century Germans, and Said is forced to flee because of the creation of Israel. And so, ironically, in the whole Israel-Palestine conflict, they technically would be on opposite sides, but this is the little twist. Whereas Said is a massive ethno-narcissist for the Palestine cause, Kissinger is very neutral and just doesn't give a crap. I mean, to quote him directly, "It's a pity both sides can't lose." And even more onto that, Kissinger is a pure intellectual realist, and he very much, I think, served his adopted country of America to the best of his ability. He had no ulterior loyalties, whereas Said, I think, was never loyal to America. He was loyal to Palestine, and I think a lot of what he did inside America was very destructive to American intellectual life. A sort of a fifth columnist, if you will, and also we're talking about I said Said gave a very sparse treatment of Spengler. Well, Henry Kissinger was incredibly influenced by Spengler, and famously, he actually gave a single volume edition of Decline of the West to Richard Nixon. And I don't know if you've seen it, Hunger, but there's this famous interview where Kissinger went on firing line with Buckley, and Buckley's interviewing him. The very first question he asks is, "So tell me, Mr. Kissinger, why did you give a single volume edition of Decline of the West to President Nixon?" And then and that's actually, that interview is when I very first heard how Kissinger sounds, and it surprised me, his accent. And I thought, well, I suppose he was born in Germany, but I just find it funny that Edward Said sounds more American than Henry Kissinger.
Oh no! Absolutely! Oh my dear Lord! Kissinger is obviously he sounds extremely Eastern European, not exactly German, but he sounds very Eastern European, and that probably comes from his Jewish roots. But yeah, the problem with Said that Kissinger does not exhibit is Said is an anti-European intellectual. Kissinger is not anti-European in any way, shape or form, and he always had again, owing to his background, he served American foreign policy to the best of his abilities, whereas Said, in his intellectual circles, was always advocating for the third world and always advocating for anti-colonialism, for the expulsion of European and American influence from the Middle East. And there's many influences and things I can agree with on. I do not think the American experience in the Middle East has been positive in any way, shape, or form. Nothing compared to the Europeans. And I think he mentions in the book, the difference between the American and European experience of the Middle East. I just want to quote this one passage if I can find it. Hold on.
Sure. Mm.
Yes. It's a very long passage. I'm not okay. Let me find it. Okay, the American experience of the Orient prior to that exceptional moment was limited. Cultural isolates like Melville were interested in it. Cynics like Mark Twain visited and wrote about it. The American transcendentalists saw affinities between Indian thought and their own, A few theologians and biblical students studied the biblical Oriental languages. There were occasional diplomatic and military encounters with the Barbary pirates and the like, the odd naval expedition to the Far Orient, and of course the ubiquitous missionary to the Orient. But there was no deeply invested tradition of Orientalism, and consequently, in the United States, of knowledge of the Orient, never passing through the refining and reticulating and reconstructing processes, whose beginning was in the philological study that it went through in Europe. Furthermore, the imaginative investment was never made either, perhaps because of the American frontier. The one that counted was the westward one. Immediately after World War II, then, the Orient became not a broad Catholic issue as it had been for centuries in Europe, but an administrative one, a matter of policy. Enter the social scientist and the new expert, on whose somewhat narrower shoulders was to fall the mantle of Orientalism. In their turn, as we shall see, they made such changes in it that it became scarcely recognizable. In any event, the new Orientalist took on the attitudes of cultural hostility and kept them. What he's saying is, okay, the Americans had no experience of the Middle East prior to the Second World War, and because of that, they didn't have that base of knowledge that European Orientalists had. And consequently, this led, I think, Said says this is a negative, because he says because America didn't have this experience, they have an even worse understanding of the Middle East than of the European Orientalists. And I'm not sure if he says this in the book, but he has said this in other interviews, that the European experience in the Middle East, because many of these Europeans lived there, they had to administer these lands. They controlled these territories. They had a colonial administration. I mean, for example, Hamilton Alexander Gibb was born in Egypt. Filippo Marinetti was born in Egypt. Many of these French and British authors had actually traveled to the Middle East and reported on their knowledge and interacted with these people on a daily basis. The colonial administrations in the British colonial administrations had to govern these people, and so there was this real relationship and this dependency on both sides between the Europeans and the Orientals. America had none of this. And because they didn't even have that, they had none of that experience, they totally misunderstood everything about the Middle East. And that's the problem we face today with the American empire. The global American empire does not understand the Middle East the way the European colonialists did. It does not understand any of the local issues. And it just comes in like a wrecking ball and destroys everything in its path, while using sociological experts and that are infected with wrong ideas, that are infected with post-colonial ideas. And we see the results of this today. Like, why is the Middle East on fire? And it is a result of American foreign policy making the situations much worse than they otherwise would have been. And I think Said is absolutely right on that.
And I think for the first time, I actually regretfully agree with him. So, oh dear. Well, how to credit you where credit due, I suppose.
The European experience. This is also another thing from BAP. European colonialism, because it actually had to deal with the reality of dealing with people on the ground, had to develop a human relationship with these people. You know, the colonizer and the colonized needed to get along and needed to be administered. And yes, there were interests behind that served the host nation, that didn't serve the native population. But you see none of that when it comes to the American involvement in the Middle East. None of that exists. Like, if Americans actually lived in Iraq and actually had to govern it from the ground up, not put in a puppet fake regime of loyal Iraqis in their place, if they actually had to administer it themselves, they would have actually understood how deep the issues in that society would have been and how to resolve them in a much better fashion. but because they didn't have that responsibility that European colonials had, and that's a huge discredit to the American foreign policy. And Americans weren't interested in the Middle East. They've never been interested in the Middle East until they had to get involved for resources like oil. Whereas the Europeans had 200 years of scholarship and literature that they cared about it, as they cared about the Middle East as an intellectual, cultural other. And American had none of that. They never cared.
Interestingly, I'm actually going to defend America very briefly and say, yes, the Americans did obviously want the resource extraction, their main source being Aramco and the oil from Saudi Arabia. But we must also remember that I think the Westerners, especially the British, did in the latter parts in the 20th century. I think there was a massive gravitation towards resource extraction, like the British with the Anglo-Persian Oil Company, now BP today in Iran, and also You've got the Iraqi Petroleum Company in Iraq, because one of the and again, I mean, it was basically the policy of people like Winston Churchill, because they wanted the oil for the Royal Navy. So they had, as I've talked about on the streams with Prude and Sykes-Picot, they captured Iraq and just had this massive pipeline go from Iraq all the way to the Mediterranean, so then you could refuel the Mediterranean fleet. So there certainly was a wanting to acquire the resources and an essence of power projection.
Oh yes, and that the Iraqi pipeline went through Syria and Lebanon, famously through the city of Tripoli. There was a huge oil refinery on the Lebanese coastline in the north that refined this oil for global export to mostly the British and the French. But and you're 100% right that as Britain was declining, its policies became more extractive. I think that's completely right. But you had 2 or 3 centuries of knowledge and experience and fascination with the Arabs as a people outside of economic concerns, and that was a huge benefit to the Europeans in their understanding.
No, fair enough. So right, we've been going at this for about 2.5 hours. So I just want to, I think we've done everything we needed to for Orientalism now. So I just want to turn to the Afterward, which is a conclusion Said added in the 90s. And this is so frustrating, the Afterwards. It just confirms everything we've discussed. But there's one reading I do want to do from it, because it's just so illustrative of his whole view. Okay. Right. Okay. So here's this reading. So the second reason why the anti-essentialism of my arguments have proven hard to accept is political and urgently ideological. I had absolutely no way of knowing that a year after the book was published, Iran would be the site of an extraordinarily far-reaching Islamic revolution, nor that the battle between Israel and Palestinians would take such savage and protracted forms. From the 1982 invasion of Lebanon to the start of the Intifada in late 1987, the end of the Cold War did not mute, much as terminate the apparently unending conflict between the East and West, as represented by the Arabs and Islam on one side and the Christian West on the other. More recent but no less acute contests developed as a result of the Soviet Union's invasion of Afghanistan, the challenge to the status quo made during the 1980s and 1990s by Islamic groups in countries as diverse as Algeria, Jordan, Lebanon, Egypt, and the occupied territories, and the various American and European responses to the creation of Islamic brigades to fight the Russians in Afghanistan from bases in Pakistan, the Gulf War, the continued support of Israel, and the emergence of Islam as a topic of alarms, if not always precise and informed, journalism and scholarship. All this inflamed the sense of persecution felt by people forced on almost a daily basis to declare themselves to be either Westerners or Easterners. No one seemed to be free from the opposition between us and them, resulting in a sense of reinforced, deepened, hardened identity that has not been particularly edifying. In such a turbulent context, Orientalism's fate was both fortunate and unfortunate. So those in the Arab and Islamic world who felt Western encroachment with anxiety and stress, it appeared to be the first book that gave a serious answer back to a West that had never actually listened to or forgiven the Oriental for being an Oriental at all. I recall one early Arabic review of the book that described the author as a champion of Arabism, a defender of the downtrodden and abused, whose mission was to engage Western authorities in the kind of epic and romantic mano a mano. Despite the exaggeration, it did convey some real sense of the West's enduring hostility as felt by Arabs, and it also conveyed a response that many educated Arabs felt was inappropriate. I will not deny that I was aware, when writing the book, of the subjective truth insinuated by Marx. In the little sentence I quoted as one of the book's epigraphs, they cannot represent themselves, they must be represented, which is that if you feel you have been denied the chance to speak your piece, you will try extremely hard to get that chance. For indeed, the subaltern can speak, as history of liberation movements in the 20th century eloquently attests, but I never felt that I was perpetuating the hostility between the two rival political and cultural monolithic blocs, whose construction I was describing and whose terrible effects I was trying to reduce. On the contrary, as I said earlier, the Orient versus Occident opposition was both misleading and highly undesirable, the less it was given credit for actually describing anything more than a fascinating history of interpretations and contesting interests, the better. I'm happy to record that many readers in Britain and America, as well as in English-speaking Africa, Asia, Australia, and the Caribbean, saw the book as stressing the actualities of what was later to be called multiculturalism, rather than xenophobia and aggressive race-orientated nationalism. And there you have it. So Edward Said, universalist, humanist extraordinaire. You're just trying to divide humanity, the West. Why have you got to separate the East away and treat them as another? But also leave the Palestinians alone. We're our own people.
Yes, God, and I didn't mean to flame the tensions between the East and the West. I only criticized all of European intellectual history and its precepts. And yeah, it's like, no, we're different. Fuck off. Edward Said is an ethno-narcissist, okay? And despite the fact that I agree with many of the things in the book, the main message overall, it's just anti-European garbage. That's what it really boils down to. And I say this as a non-European. I can recognize what he's doing is not in the interest of, one, it's in the interest of his own people under the guise of universalism, and two, as I said, this is an anti-European screed. The whole field of postcolonialism was the biggest salvo in the intellectual barrage of anti-Western thinking, and he's chiefly responsible for that. And I think he knows that, but I don't think he ever recognizes it or handles it.
No, I just think he slapped himself on the back for a job well done, essentially. So, and one other thing I want to get to, because we mentioned Kissinger earlier, and this idea of viewing the world as these cultural blocks, as he was influenced by Spengler. But Said brings up Samuel Huntington and his idea of the clash of civilizations, and he completely rejects Huntington's thesis. And what's also remarkable, I've not read that book, though I want to. I'll probably get around to it someday. But also, what's really bizarre is that he then tries to conflate this because he then brings up Francis Fukuyama, and what's interestingly enough, Fukuyama was actually the student of Huntington, but despite that, Fukuyama's went in a much more, shall we say, shit-lib direction, and he put out the book, the end of history, and interestingly enough, the Clash of Civilizations by Huntington was written in response to the end of history. Huntington was saying to his former student, "No, this is not the end of history. We are in a time of great potential civilizational clash and chaos, and we need to be ready and prepared for it." And this is so weird that Said tries to conflate Fukuyama with Huntington, even though they've got a very different view on this. And and then essentially disagree with both of them. It's just, look, you can't have your cake and eat it, Saeed.
Well, that's the thing. He wants to live in Saeed wants multicultural universalism, and I'm just like, how? Like, this is a contradiction. This is a contradiction in terms. You cannot have multicultural universalism. You either have a diverse society imposed by force. Like, everyone now knows, because we're living in 2023, that diversity is not our strength, and that if you want ethnic tensions to not implode, you need the heavy hand of the state. You need force to impose peaceful coexistence. But no, he wants to have his cake and eat it too. Like, everyone can be special. All people can have their own identity, but we all have to be progressive liberals, because that's the moral framework we have to inhabit. It's like, this doesn't work at all, and he's just a very, very early iteration of that.
Yeah, sadly. And any final comments you want to make before we wrap this up?
No, I had a blast. This was a fantastic stream. Thankfully it's over, and I never have to pick up Edward Said again. Although I am interested in his biography, and I might pick up his other book, The Question of Palestine, because the thing, again, with Said, this goes back to Conquest's laws of politics. You are conservative about what you know best, and because Said is an Arab Palestinian, he knows Palestine better than almost anybody, like on a deep historical, intellectual level. And because he cares about his own people and he's conservative about that, he understands the issue far better, and he's a far better speaker on that topic. And that's to his credit. And I think that would be a good work for that I would like to pick up. But again, it clashes with his universalism, his progressive universalism.
It does, and well, I'm not so sorry to say, I don't think I'm going to pick up any other book by him. So I think there's many other books on Orientalism which are far more constructive and interesting than anything I think he's got to say, in my view. So not that I blame you for wanting to read more about Palestine. You know, do your own thing, but I think I've had enough of Edward Said for a lifetime.
Oh no, I am chucking this book in the fireplace the minute I have the chance. Orientalism is a garbage work. The good thing about this book, actually, I will do much more reading. I'm actually more interested in the people he brings up. I'm interested in people like Hamilton Alexander Gibb. I'm interested in people like de Sacy. I'm interested in people like Lane, and those are very interesting books he cites, and I will look forward to reading those travelogues.
And it's interesting because I mentioned before I'd not heard of Richard Burton before reading this book, and Burton's fascinating, and I want to read some of his stuff. And I actually found this website. I think it's called like the Burtonia or something, and this website has like everything he ever wrote or translated up for free. So that's a really interesting resource. I might look at some point, because I would like to read the Arabian Nights at some point. So his edition would be nice.
Yes, it's a very good book, and I think another great positive from our streams together is we've actually cited better experts, much better people who are much more worth reading. People like Eli Kaduri, people like John Bagot Glubb, people like Roger Scruton. He wrote a 100-page book about Lebanon, which is one of the best books in English I found, talking about the conflict there. So, but I think we've done our best to counter Said's thesis with much better writers who understood the Middle East far better than he did.
We have brought the antidote to his poison.
Yes.
And another comment from Nami El Kazan. Mr. Hunger, your Substack on Lebanon was really on point. I couldn't agree more. And thank you for the stream, gentlemen. Well, thank you for your comment, Nami. And yes, Hunger's articles on Lebanon really are on point.
Thank you so much. I appreciate that.
Mm. All right, so now we're at the end. Is there anything you would like to share before we get out of here?
Just check out my Twitter at HungerDye, and obviously my Substack. I would like to get back into this. I would like to get back into writing on Substack, but the situation in Lebanon is very black-pilling, and I said my piece, and I don't see a viable way forward. But it's a tragedy. You know, I love my country, Lebanon. It's a shithole. It's my shithole, just like Palestine is Saeed's shithole. But we have to love our people. We have to love where we come from, and that includes Europeans.
Well, this is going to be really blackpilling, but I'm afraid to say it. I think modern Britain's becoming a bit of a shithole in its own way as well. But hopefully, we may be able to rectify that someday. Yeah. So if you
Inshallah.
look at the description, yes, inshallah, Habibi. But in the description below, I've got your Find My Friends link, which everybody can find your Twitter and Substack through that link. And in terms of this channel, you can join me tomorrow at 2 p.m. GMT when I'll be joined by Yiz the Eunuch, and we'll be discussing folk history and fantasy. So if you're interested in that, please stay tuned. And as far as I'm aware, that will be the last stream on the channel this year. And then I'll be taking a bit of a break over Christmas. But stay tuned for the new year. I've got lots of ideas, and perhaps Mr. Dye Merchant will make a return.
Hopefully we'll have something better to talk about than Saeed. Maybe we'll do the Chatham House version.
That would be fascinating. Thank you all for watching, and good night.